Section 27 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Telegraph Girl by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 2. Abraham Hall. As there was no immediate repetition of the offence, the forgiveness soon became complete, and Lucy found the interest of her life in her endeavours to be good to this weak child whom chance had thrown in her way. For Sophy Wilson was but a weak child. She was full of Alec Murray for a while, and induced Lucy to make the young man's acquaintance. The lad was earning 12 shillings a week, and if these two poor young creatures chose to love each other and get themselves married, it would be respectable, though it might be unfortunate. It would at any rate be the way of the world, and was a natural combination with which she would have no right to interfere. But she found that Alec was a mere boy, and with no idea beyond the enjoyment of a bright scarf and a penny cigar, with a girl by his side at a music hall. " I don't think it can be worth your while to go much out of your way for his sake," said Lucy. " Who is going out of her way ? Not I. He's as good as anybody else, I suppose. And one must have somebody to talk to sometimes." These last words she uttered so plaintively, showing so plainly that she was unable to endure the simple unchanging dulness of a life of labour, that Lucy's heart was thoroughly softened towards her. She had the great gift of being not the less able to sympathise with the weakness of the weak because of her own abnormal strength. And so it came to pass that she worked for her friend, stitching and mending when the girl ought to have stitched and mended for herself, reading to her even though but little of what was read might be understood, yielding to her and assisting her in all things, till at last it came to pass that in truth she loved her. And such love and care were much wanted, for the elder girl soon found that the younger was weak in health as well as weak in spirit. There were days on which she could not, or at any rate did not, go to her office. When 6 months had passed by, Lucy had not once been absent since she had begun her new life. " Have you seen the man who has come to look at our house ?" asked Sophy one day as they were walking down to the office. Lucy had seen a strange man, having met him on the stairs. " Isn't he a fine fellow ?"" For anything that I know, let us hope that he is very fine," said Lucy, laughing. " He's about as handsome a chap as I think I ever saw." As for being a chap, the man I saw must be near 40. " He is a little old, I should say, but not near that. I don't think he can have a wife, or he wouldn't come here. He's an engineer, and he has the care of a steam engine in the City Road, that great printing place. His name is Abraham Hall, and he's earning £3 or £4 a week. A man like that ought to have a wife." " How did you learn all about him ?"" It's all true. Sally heard it from Mrs. Green." Mrs. Green was the keeper of the lodging house, and Sally was the maid. " I couldn't help speaking to him yesterday, because we were both at the door together. He talked just like a gentleman, although he was all smutty and greasy." " I am glad he talked like a gentleman." " I told him we lodged here, and that we were telegraph girls, and that we never got home till 8:30. He would be just the beau for you, because he is such a big, steady looking fellow." " I don't want a beau," said Lucy angrily. " Then I shall take him for myself," said Sophy, as she entered the office. Soon after that it came to pass that there did arise a slight acquaintance between both the girls and Abraham Hall, partly from the fact of their near neighbourhood, partly because from some little tricks on Sophy's part. But the man seemed to be so steady, so solid, so little given to lightness of flirtation or to dangerous delights, that Lucy was inclined to welcome the accident. When she saw him on a Sunday morning free from the soil of his work, she could perceive that he was still a young man, probably not much over 30, but there was a look about him as though he were well inured to the cares of the world, such as is often produced by the possession of a wife and family, not a look of depression by any means, but seeming to betoken an appreciation of the seriousness of life. From all this Lucy unconsciously accepted an idea of security in the man, feeling that it might be pleasant to have some strong one near her from whom, in case of need, assistance might be asked without fear. For this man was tall and broad and powerful, and seemed to Lucy's eyes to be a very pillar of strength when he would stand still for a moment to greet her in the streets. But poor Sophy, who had so graciously offered the man to her friend at the beginning of their intercourse, seemed soon to change her mind and to desire his attention for herself. He was certainly much more worthy than Alec Murray. But to Lucy, to whom it was a rule of life as strong as any in the commandments, that a girl should not throw herself at a man, but should be sought by him, it was a painful thing to see how many of poor Sophy's much-needed sixpences were now spent in little articles of finery, by which it was hoped that Mr. Hall's eyes might be gratified, and how those glossy ringlets were brushed and made to shine with pomatum, and how the little collars were washed and re-washed, and starched and re-starched, in order that she might be smart for him. Lucy, who was always neat, endeavoured to become browner and browner. This she did by way of reproach and condemnation, not at all surmising that Mr. Hall might possibly prefer a good solid wearing colour to glittering blue and pink gewgaws. At this time Sophy was always full of what Mr. Hall had last said to her, and after a while broached an idea that he was some gentleman in disguise. "Why in disguise? Why not a gentleman not in disguise?" asked Lucy, who had her own ideas, perhaps a little exaggerated, as to nature's gentleman. Then Sophy explained herself. A gentleman, a real gentleman, in disguise would be very interesting. One who had quarrelled with his father, perhaps, because he could not endure paternal tyranny, and had then determined to earn his own bread till he might happily come into the family honours and property in a year or two. Perhaps, instead of being Abraham Hall, he was in reality the Right Honourable Russell Howard Cavendish, and if, during his temporary abeyance, he should prove his thorough emancipation from the thraldom of his aristocracy by falling in love with a telegraph girl, how fine it would be! When Lucy expressed an opinion that Mr. Hall might be a very fine fellow, though he were fulfilling no more than the normal condition of his life at the present moment, Sophy would not be contented, declaring that her friend, with all her reading, knew nothing of poetry. In this way they talked very frequently about Abraham Hall, till Lucy would often feel that such talking was indecorous. Then she would be silent for a while herself, and rebuke the other girl for her constant mention of the man's name. Then again she would be brought back to the subject, for in all the little intercourse which took place between them and the man, his conduct was so simple and yet so civil that she could not really feel him to be unworthy of a place in her thoughts. But Sophy soon declared frankly to her friend that she was absolutely in love with the man. "You wouldn't have him, you know," she said, when Lucy scolded her for the avowal. "Have him? How could you bring yourself to talk in such a way about a man? What does he want of either of us?" "Men do marry, you know, sometimes," said Sophy, "and I don't know how a young man is to get a wife unless some girl will show that she is fond of him." "He should show first that he is fond of her." "That's all very well for talky, said Sophy, "but it doesn't do for practice. Men are awfully shy, and then, though they do marry sometimes, they don't want to get married particularly, not as we do. It comes like an accident. But how is a man to fall into a pit if there's no pit open?" In answer to this Lucy used many arguments and much scolding, but to very little effect. That the other girl should have thought so much about it and be so ready with her arguments was horrid to her. "A pit open!" ejaculated Lucy. "I would rather never speak to a man again than regard myself in such a light." Sophy said that all that might be very well, but declared that it would not wash. The elder girl was so much shocked by all this that there came upon her gradually a feeling of doubt whether their joint life could be continued. Sophy declared her purpose openly of entrapping Abraham Hall into a marriage, and had absolutely induced him to take her to the theatre. He had asked Lucy to join them, but she had sternly refused, basing her refusal on her inability to bear the expense. When he offered to give her the treat, she told him with simple gravity that nothing would induce her to accept such a favour from any man who was not either a very old friend or a near relation. When she said this, he so looked at her that she was sure that he approved of her resolve. He did not say a word to press her, but he took Sophy Wilson and, as Lucy knew, paid for Sophy's ticket. All this displeased Lucy so much that she began to think whether there must not be a separation. She could not continue to live on terms of affectionate friendship with a girl whose conduct she so strongly disapproved. But then again, though she could not restrain the poor light thing altogether, she did restrain her in some degree. She was doing some good by her companionship. And then, if it really was in the man's mind to marry the girl, that certainly would be a good thing for the girl. With such a husband she would be steady enough. She was quite sure that the idea of preparing a pit for such a one as Abraham Hall must be absurd. But Sophy was pretty and clever, and if married would at any rate love her husband. Lucy thought she had heard that steady, severe, thoughtful men were apt to attach themselves to women of the butterfly order. She did not like the way in which Sophy was doing this, but then who was she that she should be a judge? If Abraham Hall liked it, would not that be much more to the purpose? Therefore she resolved that there should be no separation at present, and, if possible, no quarrelling. But soon it came to pass that there was another very solid reason against separation. Sophy, who was often unwell, and would sometimes stay away from the office for a day or two on the score of ill health, though by doing so she lost one of her 3 shillings on each such day, gradually became worse. The superintendent at her department had declared that in case of further absence a medical certificate must be sent, and the doctor attached to the office had called upon her. He had looked grave, had declared that she wanted considerable care, had then gone so far as to recommend rest, which meant absence from work, for at least a fortnight, and ordered her medicine. This of course meant the loss of 1/3 of her wages. In such circumstances and at such a time it was not likely that Lucy should think of separation. While Sophy was ill, Abraham Hall often came to the door to inquire after her health, so often that Lucy almost thought that her friend had succeeded. The man seemed to be sympathetic and anxious, and would hardly have inquired with so much solicitude had he not really been anxious as to poor Sophy's health. Then, when Sophy was better, he would come in to see her, and the girl would deck herself out with some little ribbon, and would have her collar always starched and ironed, ready for his reception. It certainly did seem to Lucy that the man was becoming fond of her foolish little friend. During this period Lucy of course had to go to the office alone, leaving Sophy to the care of the lodging-house keeper. And in her solitude troubles were heavy on her. In the first place, Sophy's illness had created certain necessarily increased expenses, and at the same time their joint incomes had been diminished by 1 shilling a week out of 6. Lucy was in general matters allowed to be the dispenser of the money, but on occasion the other girl would assert her rights, which always meant her right to some indulgence out of their joint incomes, which would be an indulgence to her and her alone. Even those bright ribbons could not be had for nothing. Lucy wanted no bright ribbons. When they were fairly prosperous she had not grudged some little expenditure in this direction. She had told herself that young girls liked to be bright in the eyes of men, and that she had no right even to endeavour to make her friend look at all these things with her eyes. She even confessed to herself some deficiency on her own part, some want of womanliness in that she did not aspire to be attractive, still owning to herself, vehemently declaring to herself, that to be attractive in the eyes of a man whom she could love would of all delights be the most delightful. Thinking of all this, she had endeavoured not to be angry with poor Sophy, but when she became pinched for shillings and sixpences, and to feel doubtful whether at the end of each fortnight there would be money to pay Mrs. Green for lodgings and coal, then her heart became sad within her, and she told herself that Sophy, though she was ill, ought to be more careful. And there was another trouble which for a while was very grievous. Telegraphy is an art not yet perfected among us, and is still subject to many changes. Now it was the case at this time that the pundits of the office were in favour of a system of communicating messages by ear instead of by eye. The little dots and pricks, which even in Lucy's time had been changed more than once, had quickly become familiar to her. No one could read and use her telegraphic literature more rapidly or correctly than Lucy Graham. But now that this system of little tinkling sounds was coming up, a system which seemed to be very pleasant to those females who were gifted with musical aptitudes, she found herself to be less quick, less expert, less useful than her neighbours. This was very sad, for she had always been buoyed up by an unconscious conviction of her own superior intelligence. And then, though there had been neither promises nor threats, she had become aware, at any rate had thought that she was aware, that those girls who could catch and use the tinkling sounds would rise more quickly to higher pay than the less gifted ones. She had struggled, therefore, to overcome the difficulty. She had endeavoured to force her ears to do that which her ears were not capable of accomplishing. She had failed, and to-day had owned to herself that she must fail. But Sophy had been one of the first to catch the tinkling sounds. Lucy came back to her room sad and down at heart, and full of troubles. She had a long task of needlework before her, which had been put by for a while through causes consequent on Sophy's illness. Now she is better, perhaps he will marry her, and take her away, and I shall be alone again, she said to herself, as though declaring that such a state of things would be a relief to her, and almost a happiness. "He has just been here," said Sophy to her as soon as she entered the room. Sophy was painfully, cruelly smart, clean and starched, and shining about her looks, so prepared that, as Lucy thought, she must have evidently expected him. "Well, and what did he say?" "He has not said much yet, but it was very good of him to come and see me, and he was looking so handsome. He is going out somewhere this evening to some political meeting with 2 or 3 other men, and he was got up quite like a gentleman. I do like to see him look like that." "I always think a working man looks best in his working clothes," said Lucy. "There's some truth about him then. When he gets into a black coat he is pretending to be something else, but everybody can see the difference." There was a severity, almost a savageness in this, which surprised Sophy so much that at first she hardly knew how to answer it. "He is going to speak at the meeting," she said, after a pause. "And of course he had to make himself tidy. He told me all that he is going to say. Should you not like to hear him speak?" "No," said Lucy very sharply, setting to work instantly upon her labours, not giving herself a moment for preparation or a moment for rest. Why should she like to hear a man speak who would condescend to love so empty and so vain a thing as that? Then she became gradually ashamed of her own feelings. "Yes," she said, "I think I should like to hear him speak, only if I were not quite so tired. Mr. Hall is a man of good sense and well educated, and I think I should like to hear him speak." "I should like to hear him say one thing, I know," said Sophy. Then Lucy, in her rage, tore asunder some fragment of a garment on which she was working. Chapter 2. Section 28 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices, and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Telegraph Girl, by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 3. Sophy Wilson Goes to Hastings. Sophy went back to her work, and in a very few days was permanently moved from the seat which she had hitherto occupied next to Alec Murray and near to Lucy, to a distant part of the chamber in which the tinkling instruments were used. And as a part of the arrangement consequent on this, she was called on to attend from 10 till 6 instead of from noon till 8. And her hour for dining was changed also. In this way a great separation between the girls was made, for neither could they walk to the office together, nor walk from it. To Lucy, though she was sometimes inclined to be angry with her friend, this was very painful. But Sophy triumphed in it greatly. "I think we are to have a step up to 21 shillings in the musical box," she said, laughing. For it was so that she called the part of the room in which the little bells were always ringing. "Won't it be nice to have 3 shillings 6pence instead of 3 shillings?" Lucy said solemnly that any increase of income was always nice, and that when such income was earned by superiority of acquirement, it was a matter of just pride. This she enunciated with something of a dogmatic air, having schooled herself to give all due praise to Sophy, although it had to be given at the expense of her own feelings. But when Sophy said in reply that that was just what she had been thinking herself, and that as she could do her work by ear, she was of course worth more than those who could not, then the other could only with difficulty repress the soreness of her heart. But to Sophy I think the new arrangements were most pleasant, because it enabled her to reach the street in which she lived just when Abraham Hall was accustomed to return from his work. He would generally come home, to clean himself as she called it, and would then again go out for his employment or amusement for the evening. And now, by a proper system of lying in wait, by creeping slow or walking quick, and by watching well, she was generally able to have a word or two with him. But he was so very bashful. He would always call her Miss Wilson, and she of course was obliged to call him Mr. Hall. "How is Miss Graham?" he asked one evening. "She is very well. I think Lucy is always well. I never knew anybody so strong as she is." "It is a great blessing. And how are you yourself?" "I do get so tired of that nasty office, though of course I like what I am doing now better than the other. It was that rolling up the bands that used to kill me. But I don't think I shall ever really be strong till I get away from the telegraphs. I suppose you have no young ladies where you are?" "There are, I believe, a lot of them in the building, stitching bindings, but I never see them." "I don't think you care much for young ladies, Mr. Hall?" "Not much, now." "Why not now? What does that mean?" "I dare say I never told you or Miss Graham before, but I had a wife of my own for a time." "A wife? You?" "Yes, indeed; but she did not stay with me long. She left me before we had been a year married." "Left you?" "She died," he said, correcting very quickly the false impression which his words had been calculated to make. "Dear me! Died before a year was out? How sad!" "It was very sad." "And you had no baby, Mr. Hall?" "I wish she had had none, because then she would still have been living. Yes, I have a boy. Poor little mortal! It is 2 years old, I think, to day." "I should so much like to see him. A little boy. Do bring him some day, Mr. Hall." Then the father explained that the child was in the country, down in Hertfordshire, but nevertheless he promised that he would some day bring him up to town and show him to his new friends. Surely, having once been married and having a child, he must want another wife. And yet how little apt he was to say or do any of those things by saying and doing which men are supposed to express their desire in that direction. He was very slow at making love, so slow that Sophy hardly found herself able to make use of her own little experiences with him. Alec Murray, who, however, in the way of a husband was not worth thinking of, had a great deal more to say for himself. She could put on her ribbons for Mr. Hall, and wait for him in the streets, and look up into his face and call him Mr. Hall, but she could not tell him how dearly she would love that little boy, and what an excellent mother she would be to him, unless he gave her some encouragement. When Lucy heard that he had been a married man, and that he had a child, she was gratified, though she knew not why. "Yes, I should like to see him, of course," she said, speaking of the boy. "A child, if you have not the responsibility of taking care of it, is always nice." "I should so like to take care of it." "I should not like to ask him to bring the boy up out of the country." She paused a moment and then added, "He is just the man whom I should have thought would have married, and just the man to be made very serious by the grief of such a loss. I am coming to think it does a person good to have to bear troubles." You would not say that if you always felt as sick as I do after your day's work." About a week after that Sophy was so weak in the middle of the day that she was obliged to leave the office and go home. " I know it will kill me," she said that evening, " if I go on with it. The place is so stuffy and nasty, and then those terrible stairs. If I could get out of it and settle down, then I should be quite well. I am not made for that kind of work, not like you are." " I think I was made for it, certainly." " It is such a blessing to be strong," said poor Sophy. " Yes ; it is a blessing, and I do bless God that He has made me so. It is the one good thing that has been given to me, and it is better, I think, than all the others." As she said this she looked at Sophy and thought that she was very pretty ; but she thought also that prettiness had its dangers and its temptations, and that good strong serviceable health might perhaps be better for one who had to earn her bread. But through all these thoughts there was a great struggle going on within her. To be able to earn one's bread without personal suffering is very good. To be tempted by prettiness to ribbons, pomatum, and vanities which one cannot afford is very bad. To do as Sophy was doing in regard to this young man, setting her cap at him and resolving to make a prey of him as a fowler does of a bird, was, to her way of thinking, most unseemly. But to be loved by such a man as Abraham Hall, to be chosen by him as his companion, to be removed from the hard, outside, unwomanly work of the world to the indoor occupations which a husband would require from her, how much better a life, according to her real tastes, would that be than anything which she now saw before her? It was all very well to be brown and strong while the exigencies of her position were those which now surrounded her, but she could not keep herself from dreaming of something which would have been much better than that. A month or two passed away, during which the child had on one occasion been brought up to town on a Saturday evening, and had been petted and washed and fed and generally cared for by the two girls during this Sunday, all of which greatly increased their intimacy with the father. And now, as Lucy quickly observed, Abraham Hall called Sophy by her Christian name. When the word was first pronounced in Lucy's presence, Sophy blushed and looked round at her friend ; but she never said that the change had been made at her own request. " I do so hate to be called Miss Wilson," she had said. " It seems among friends as though I were 100 years old." Then he had called her Sophy ; but she did not dare, not as yet, to call him Abraham. All of which the other girl watched very closely, saying nothing. But during these 2 months Sophy had been away from her office more than half the time. Then the doctor said she had better leave town for a while. It was September, and it was desired that she should pass that month at Hastings. Now it should be explained that in such emergencies as this the department has provided a most kindly aid for young women. Some 5 or 6 at a time are sent out for a month to Hastings or to Brighton, and are employed in the telegraph offices in those towns. Their railway fares are paid for them, and a small extra allowance is made to them to enable them to live away from their homes. The privilege is too generally sought to be always at the command of her who wants it, nor is it accorded except on the doctor's certificate. But in the September Sophy Wilson was sent down to Hastings. In spite, however, of the official benevolence which greatly lightened the special burden which illness must always bring on those who have to earn their bread, and which in Sophy Wilson's case had done so much for her, nevertheless the weight of the misfortune fell heavily on poor Lucy. Some little struggle had to be made as to clothes before the girl could be sent away from her home, and though the sick one was enabled to support herself at Hastings, the cost of the London lodgings, which should have been divided, fell entirely upon Lucy. Then at the end of the month there came worse tidings. The doctor at Hastings declared that the girl was unfit to go back to her work, was, indeed, altogether unfit for such effort as 8 hours' continued attendance required from her. She wanted at any rate some period of perfect rest, and therefore she remained down at the seaside without the extra allowance which was so much needed for her maintenance. Then the struggle became very severe with Lucy, so severe that she began to doubt whether she could long endure it. Sophy had her 2 shillings a day, the 2/3 of her wages, but she could not subsist on that. Something had to be sent to her in addition, and this something could only come from Lucy's wages. So at least it was at first. In order to avoid debt she gave up her more comfortable room and went upstairs into a little garret. And she denied herself the accustomed dinner at the office, contenting herself with bread and cheese, or often simply with bread, which she could take in her pocket. And she washed her own clothes and mended even her own boots, so that still she might send a part of her earnings to the sick one. " Is she better ?" Abraham asked her one day. " It is hard to know, Mr. Hall. She writes just as she feels at the moment. I am afraid she fears to return to the office." " Perhaps it does not suit her." " I suppose not. She thinks some other kind of life would be better for her. I dare say it would." " Could I do anything ?" asked the man very slowly. Could he do anything ? Well, yes. Lucy at least thought that he could do a great deal. There was one thing which, if he would do it, would make Sophy at any rate believe herself to be well. And this sickness was not organic, was not, as it appeared, due to any cause which could be specified. It had not as yet been called by any name, such as consumption. General debility had been spoken of both by the office doctor and by him at Hastings. Now Lucy certainly thought that a few words from Mr. Hall would do more than all the doctors in the way of effecting a cure. Sophy hated the telegraph office, and she lacked the strength of mind necessary for doing that which was distasteful to her. And that idea of a husband had taken such hold of her that nothing else seemed to give her a prospect of contentment. " Why don't you go down and see her, Mr. Hall ?" she said. Then he was silent for a while before he answered, silent and very thoughtful. And Lucy, as the sound of her own words rested on her ears, felt she had done wrong in asking such a question. Why should he go down, unless indeed he were in love with the girl and prepared to ask her to be his wife? If he were to go down expressly to visit her at Hastings, unless he were so prepared, what false hopes he would raise, what damage he would do instead of good. How indeed could he possibly go down on such a mission without declaring to all the world that he intended to make the girl his wife? But it was necessary that the question should be answered. " I could do no good by that," he said. " No, perhaps not. Only I thought " "What did you think?" Now he asked a question, and showed plainly by his manner that he expected an answer. " I don't know," said Lucy, blushing. " I suppose I ought not to have thought anything. But you seemed to be so fond of her." " Fond of her ? Well, one does get fond of kind neighbours. I suppose you would think me impertinent, Miss Lucy," he had never made even this approach to familiarity before, " if I were to say that I am fond of both of you." " No, indeed," she replied, thinking that as a fondness declared by a young man for 2 girls at one and the same moment could not be interesting, so neither could it be impertinent. " I don't think I should do any good by going down. All that kind of thing costs so much money." " Of course it does, and I was very wrong." " But I should like to do something, Miss Lucy." And then he put his hand into his trousers pocket, and Lucy knew that he was going to bring forth money. She was very poor, but the idea of taking money from him was shocking to her. According to her theory of life, even though Sophy had been engaged to the man as his promised wife, she should not consent to accept maintenance from him or pecuniary aid till she had been made, in very truth, flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone. Presents an engaged girl might take, of course, but hardly even presents of simple utility. A shawl might be given, so that it was a pretty thing, and not a shawl merely for warmth. An engaged girl should rather live on bread and water up to her marriage than take the means of living from the man she loved till she could take it by right of having become his wife. Such were her feelings, and now she knew that this man was about to offer her money. " We shall do very well," she said, " Sophy and I together." "You are very hard pinched," he replied. "You have given up your room." "Yes, I have done that. When I was alone I did not want so big a place." "I suppose I understand all about it," he said somewhat roughly, or perhaps gruffly would be the better word. "I think there is one thing poor people ought never to do. They ought never to be ashamed of being poor among themselves." Then she looked up into his face, and as she did so a tear formed itself in each of her eyes. "Am I ashamed of anything before you?" she asked. "You are afraid of telling the truth, lest I should offer to help you. I know you don't have your dinner regular as you used to." "Who has dared to tell you that, Mr. Hall? What is my dinner to anybody?" "Well; it is something to me. If we are going to be friends, of course I don't like seeing you go without your meals. You'll be ill next yourself." "I am very strong." "It isn't the way to keep so, to work without the victuals you used to." He was talking to her now in such a tone as to make her almost feel that he was scolding her. "No good can come of that. You are sending your money down to Hastings to her." "Of course we share everything." "You wouldn't take anything from me for yourself, I dare say. Anybody can see how proud you are. But if I leave it for her, I don't think you have a right to refuse it. Of course she wants it if you don't." With that he brought out a sovereign and put it down on the table. "Indeed I couldn't, Mr. Hall," she said. "I may give it to her if I please." "You can send it to her yourself," said Lucy, not knowing how else to answer him. "No, I couldn't. I don't know her address." Then without waiting for another word he walked out of the room, leaving the sovereign on the table. This occurred in a small back parlour on the ground floor, which was in the occupation of the landlady, but was used sometimes by the lodgers for such occasional meetings. What was she to do with the sovereign? She would be very angry if any man were to send her a sovereign. But it was not right that she should measure Sophy's feelings by her own. And then it might still be that the man was sending the present to the girl whom he intended to make his wife. But why had he asked about her dinner? What were her affairs to him? Would she not have gone without her dinner for ever rather than have taken it at his hands? And yet, who was there in all the world of whom she thought so well as of him? And so she took the sovereign upstairs with her into her garret. Chapter 4. Section 29 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Telegraph Girl by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 4. Mr. Brown, the Hairdresser. Lucy, when she got up to her own little room with the sovereign, sat for a while on the bed crying, but she could not in the least explain to herself why it was that she was shedding tears at this moment. It was not because Sophy was ill, though that was cause to her of great grief, nor because she herself was so hard put to it for money to meet her wants. It may be doubted whether grief or pain ever does of itself produce tears, which are rather the outcome of some emotional feeling. She was not thinking much of Sophy as she cried, nor certainly were her own wants present to her mind. The sovereign was between her fingers, but she did not at first even turn her mind to that, or consider what had best be done with it. But what right had he to make inquiry as to her poverty? It was that, she told herself, which now provoked her to anger, so that she wept from sheer vexation. Why should he have searched into her wants and spoken to her of her need of victuals? What had there been between them to justify him in tearing away that veil of custom which is always supposed to hide our private necessities from our acquaintances till we ourselves feel called upon to declare them? He had talked to her about her meals. He ought to know that she would starve rather than accept one from him. Yes, she was very angry with him, and would henceforth keep herself aloof from him. But still, as she sat, there were present to her eyes and ears the form and words of an heroic man. He had seemed to scold her, but there are female hearts which can be better reached and more surely touched by the truth of anger than by the patent falseness of flattery. Had he paid her compliments, she would not now have been crying, nor would she have complained to herself of his usage, but she certainly would not have sat thinking of him, wondering what sort of woman had been that young wife to whom he had first given himself, wondering whether it was possible that Sophy should be good enough for him. Then she got up, and looking down upon her own hand, gazed at the sovereign till she had made up her mind what she would do with it. She at once sat down and wrote to Sophy. She had made up her mind. There should be no diminution in the contribution made from her own wages. In no way should any portion of that sovereign administer to her own comfort. Though she might want her accustomed victuals ever so badly, they should not come to her from his earnings. So she told Sophy in the letter that Mr. Hall had expressed great anxiety for her welfare, and had begged that she would accept a present from him. She was to get anything with the sovereign that might best tend to her happiness. But the shilling a day which Lucy contributed out of her own wages was sent with the sovereign. For an entire month she did not see Abraham Hall again, so as to do more than just speak to him on the stairs. She was almost inclined to think that he was cold and unkind in not seeking her, and yet she wilfully kept out of his way. On each Sunday it would have at any rate been easy for her to meet him, but with a stubborn purpose which she did not herself understand, she kept herself apart, and when she met him on the stairs, which she would do occasionally when she returned from her work, she would hardly stand till she had answered his inquiries after Sophy. But at the end of the month one evening he came up and knocked on her door. "I am sorry to intrude, Miss Lucy." "It is no intrusion, Mr. Hall. I wish I had a place to ask you to sit down in." "I have come to bring another trifle for Miss Sophy." "Pray do not do it. I cannot send it to her. She ought not to take it. I am sure you know that she ought not to take it." "I know nothing of the kind. If I know anything, it is that the strong should help the weak, and the healthy the sick. Why should she not take it from me as well as from you?" It was necessary that Lucy should think a little before she could answer this. But when she had thought, her answer was ready. "We are both girls." "Is there anything which ought to confine kindness to this or the other sex? If you were knocked down in the street, would you let no one but a woman pick you up?" "It is not the same. I know you understand it, Mr. Hall. I am sure you do." Then he also paused to think what he would say, for he was conscious that he did understand it. For a young woman to accept money from a man seemed to imply that some return of favours would be due. But, he said to himself, that feeling came from what was dirty and not from what was noble in the world. "You ought to lift yourself above all that," he said at last. "Yes, you ought. You are very good, but you would be better if you would do so. You say that I understand, and I think that you, too, understand." This again was said in that voice which seemed to scold, and again her eyes became full of tears. Then he was softer on a sudden. "Good night, Miss Lucy. You will shake hands with me, will you not?" She put her hand in his, being perfectly conscious at the moment that it was the first time that she had ever done so. What a mighty hand it seemed to be as it held hers for a moment. "I will put the sovereign on the table," he said, again leaving the room and giving her no option as to its acceptance. But she made up her mind at once that she would not be the means of sending his money to Sophy Wilson. She was sure that she would take nothing from him for her own relief, and therefore sure that neither ought Sophy to do so, at any rate unless there had been more between them than either of them had told to her. But Sophy must judge for herself. She sent, therefore, the sovereign back to Hall with a little note as follows: "Dear Mr. Hall, Sophy's address is at Mrs. Pike's, 19 Paradise Row, Fairlight, near Hastings. You can do as you like as to writing her. I am obliged to send back the money which you have so very generously left for her, because I do not think she ought to accept it. If she were quite in want it might be different, but we have still 5 shillings a day between us. If a young woman were starving, perhaps it ought to be the same as though she were being run over in the street, but it is not like that. In my next letter I shall tell Sophy all about it. Yours truly, Lucy Graham." The following evening, when she came home, he was standing at the house door, evidently waiting for her. She had never seen him loitering in that way before, and she was sure that he was there in order that he might speak to her. "I thought I would let you know that I got the sovereign safely," he said. "I am so sorry that you should have returned it." "I am sure that I was right, Mr. Hall." "There are cases in which it is very hard to say what is right and what is wrong. Some things seem right because people have been wrong so long. To give and take among friends ought to be right." "We can only do what we think right," she said, as she passed in through the passage upstairs. She felt sure from what had passed that he had not sent the money to Sophy. But why not? Sophy had said that he was bashful. Was he so far bashful that he did not dare himself to send the money to the girl he loved, though he had no scruple as to giving it to her through another person? And as for bashfulness, it seemed to her that the man spoke out his mind clearly enough. He could scold her, she thought, without any difficulty, for it still seemed that his voice and manner were rough to her. He was never rough to Sophy, but then she had heard so often that love will alter a man amazingly. Then she wrote her letter to Sophy and explained as well as she could the whole affair. She was quite sure that Sophy would regret the loss of the money. Sophy, she knew, would have accepted it without scruple. People, she said to herself, will be different. But she endeavoured to make her friend understand that she, with her feelings, could not be the medium of sending on presents of which she disapproved. "I have given him your address," she said, "and he can suit himself as to writing to you." In this letter she enclosed a money order for the contribution made to Sophy's comfort out of her own wages. Sophy's answer, which came in a day or two, surprised her very much. "As to Mr. Hall's money," she began, "as things stand at present, perhaps it is as well that you didn't take it." As Lucy had expected that grievous fault would be found with her, this was comfortable. But it was after that that the real news came. Sophy was a great deal better. That was also good tidings. But she did not want to leave Hastings just at present. Indeed, she thought that she did not want to leave it at all. A very gentlemanlike young man, who was just going to be taken into partnership in a hairdressing establishment, had proposed to her, and she had accepted him. Then there were two wishes expressed. The first was that Lucy would go on a little longer with her kind generosity, and the second, that Mr. Hall would not feel it very much. As regarded the first wish, Lucy resolved that she would go on, at least for the present. Sophy was still on sick leave from the office, and even though she might be engaged to a hairdresser, was still to be regarded as an invalid. But as to Mr. Hall, she thought that she could do nothing. She could not even tell him, at any rate till that marriage at Hastings was quite a settled thing. But she thought that Mr. Hall's future happiness would not be lessened by the event. Though she had taught herself to love Sophy, she had been unable not to think that her friend was not a fitting wife for such a man. But in telling herself that he would have an escape, she put it to herself as though the fault lay chiefly in him. He is so stern and so hard that he would have crushed her, and she never would have understood his justness and honesty. In her letter of congratulation, which was very kind, she said not a word of Abraham Hall, but she promised to go on with her own contribution till things were a little more settled. In the meantime she was very poor. Even brown dresses won't wear for ever, let them be ever so brown, and in the first flurry of sending Sophy off to Hastings, with that decent apparel which had perhaps been the means of winning the hairdresser's heart, she had got somewhat into debt with her landlady. This she was gradually paying off, even on her reduced wages, but the effort pinched her closely. Day by day, in spite of all her efforts with her needle, she became sensible of a deterioration in her outward appearance which was painful to her at the office, and which made her most careful to avoid any meeting with Abraham Hall. Her boots were very bad, and she had now for some time given up even the pretence of gloves as she went backwards and forwards to the office. But perhaps it was her hat that was most vexatious. The brown straw hat which had lasted her all the summer and autumn could hardly be induced to keep its shape now when November was come. One day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Abraham Hall went to the post office, and having inquired among the messengers, made his way up to the telegraph department at the top of the building. There he asked for Miss Graham, and was told by the doorkeeper that the young ladies were not allowed to receive visitors during office hours. He persisted, however, explaining that he had no wish to go into the room, but that it was a matter of importance, and that he was very anxious that Miss Graham should be asked to come out to him. Now, it is a rule that the staff of the department, who are engaged in sending and receiving messages, the privacy of which may be of vital importance, should be kept during the hours of work as free as possible from communication with the public. It is not that either the girls or the young men would be prone to tell the words which they had been the means of passing on to their destination, but that it might be worth the while of some sinner to offer great temptation, and that the power of offering it should be lessened as much as possible. Therefore, when Abraham Hall pressed his request, the doorkeeper told him that it was quite impossible. "Do you mean to say that if it were an affair of life and death she could not be called out?" Abraham said in that voice which had sometimes seemed to Lucy to be so impressive. "She is not a prisoner." "I don't know as to that," replied the man. "You would have to see the superintendent, I suppose." "Then let me see the superintendent." And at last he did succeed in seeing someone whom he so convinced of the importance of his message as to bring Lucy to the door. "Miss Graham," he said, when they were at the top of the stairs, and so far alone that no one else could hear him, "I want you to come out with me for half an hour." "I don't think I can. They won't let me." "Yes, they will. I have to say something which I must say now." "Will not the evening do, Mr. Hall?" "No, I must go out of town by the mail train from Paddington, and it will be too late. Get your hat and come with me for half an hour." Then she remembered her hat, and she snatched a glance at her poor stained dress, and she looked up at him. He was not dressed in his working clothes, and his face and hands were clean, and altogether there was a look about him of well-to-do manly tidiness which added to her feeling of shame. "If you will go on to the house, I will follow you," she said. "Are you ashamed to walk with me?" "I am, because—" He had not understood her at first, but now he understood it all. "Get your hat," he said, "and come with a friend who is really a friend. You must come, you must indeed." Then she felt herself compelled to obey, and went back and got her old hat, and followed him down the stairs into the street. "And so Miss Wilson is going to be married," were the first words he said in the street. "Has she written to you?" "Yes, she has told me all about it. I am so glad that she should be settled to her liking out of town. She says that she is nearly well now. I hope that Mr. Brown is a good sort of man, and that he will be kind to her." It could hardly be possible, Lucy thought, that he should have taken her away from the office merely to talk to her of Sophy's prospects. It was evident that he was strong enough to conceal any chagrin which might have been caused by Sophy's apostasy. Could it, however, be the case that he was going to leave London because his feelings had been too much disturbed to allow of his remaining quiet? "And so you are going away? Is it for long?" "Well, yes; I suppose it is for always." Then there came upon her a sense of increased desolation. Was he not her only friend? And then, though she had refused all pecuniary assistance, there had been present to her a feeling that there was near to her a strong human being whom she could trust, and who in any last extremity could be kind to her. "For always! And you go to-night?" Then she thought that he had been right to insist on seeing her. It certainly would have been a great blow to her if he had gone without a word of farewell. "There is a man wanted immediately to look after the engines at a great establishment on the Wye, in the Forest of Dean. They have offered me £4 a week." £4 a week! "But I must go at once. It has been talked about for some time, and now it has come all in a clap. I have to be off without a day's notice almost before I know where I am. As for leaving London, it is just what I like. I love the country." "Oh yes," said Lucy, "that will be nice. And about your little boy?" Could it be that she was to be asked to do something for the child? They were now at the door of their house. "Here we are," he said, "and perhaps I can say better inside what I have got to say." Then she followed him into the back sitting room on the ground floor. Chapter 5. Section 30 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Telegraph Girl by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 5. Abraham Hall Married. "Yes," he said, "about my little boy. I could not say what I had to say in the street, though I had thought to do so." Then he paused, and she sat herself down, feeling, she did not know why, as though she would lack strength to hear him if he stood. It was then the case that some particular service was to be demanded from her, something that would show his confidence in her. The very idea of this seemed at once to add a grace to her life. She would have the child to love, there would be something for her to do, and there must be letters between her and him. It would certainly add a grace to her life, but how odd that he should not take the child with him. He had paused a moment while she thought of all this, and she was aware that he was looking at her, but she did not dare to return his gaze or even to glance up at his face. And then gradually she felt that she was shivering and trembling. What was it that ailed her just now when it would be so necessary that she should speak out with some strength? She had eaten nothing since her breakfast when he had come to her, and she was afraid that she would show herself to be weak. "Will you be his mother?" he said. What did it mean? How was she to answer him? She knew that his eyes were on her, but hers were more than ever firmly fixed upon the floor. And she was aware that she ought briskly to have acceded to his request, so as to have shown by her ready alacrity that she had attributed no other meaning to the words than they had been intended to convey, that she had not for a moment been guilty of rash folly. But though it was so imperative upon her to say a word, yet she could not speak. Everything was swimming round her. She was not even sure that she could sit upon her chair. "Lucy," he said. Then she thought she would have fallen. "Lucy, will you be my wife?" There was no doubt about the word. Her sense of hearing was at any rate not deficient. And there came upon her at once a thorough conviction that all her troubles had been changed for ever and a day into joys and blessings. The word had been spoken from which he certainly would never go back, and which of course, must be a commandment to her. But yet there was an unfitness about it which disturbed her, and she was still powerless to speak. The remembrance of the meanness of her clothes and poorness of her position came upon her, so that it would be her duty to tell him that she was not fit for him, and yet she could not speak. "If you will say that you want time to think about it, I shall be contented," he said. But she did not want a moment to think about it. She could not have confessed to herself that she had learned to love him, oh, so much too dearly, if it were not for this most unexpected, most unthought of, almost impossible revelation. But she did not want a moment to make herself sure that she did love him. Yet she could not speak. "Will you say that you will think of it for a month?" Then there came upon her an idea that he was not asking this because he loved her, but in order that he might have a mother whom he could trust for his child. Even that would have been flattering, but that would not have sufficed. Then, when she told herself what she was, or rather what she thought herself to be, she felt sure that he could not really love her. Why should such a man as he love such a woman? Then her mouth was opened. "You cannot want me for myself," she said. "Not for yourself? Then why? I am not the man to seek any girl for her fortune, and you have none." Then again she was dumbfounded. She could not explain what she meant. She could not say, because I am brown, and because I am plain, and because I have become thin and worn from want, and because my clothes are old and shabby? I ask you," he said, "because with all my heart I love you." It was as though the heavens had been opened to her. That he should speak a word that was not true to her was impossible. And, as it was so, she would not coy her love to him for a moment. If only she could have found words with which to speak to him. She could not even look up at him, but she put out her hand so as to touch him. "Lucy," he said, "stand up and come to me." Then she stood up, and with one little step crept close to his side. "Lucy, can you love me?" And as he asked the question his arm was pressed round her waist, and as she put up her hand to welcome rather than to restrain his embrace, she again felt the strength, the support, and the warmth of his grasp. "Will you not say that you love me?" "I am such a poor thing," she replied. "A poor thing, are you? Well, yes, there are different ways of being poor. I have been poor enough in my time, but I never thought myself a poor thing, and you must not say it ever of yourself again." "No?" "My girl must not think herself a poor thing. May I not say, my girl?" Then there was just a little murmur, a sound which would have been yes, but for the inability of her lips to open themselves. "And if my girl, then my wife. And shall my wife be called a poor thing? No, Lucy. I have seen it all. I don't think I like poor things. But I like you." "Do you?" "I do. And now I must go back to the City Road and give up charge and take my money, and I must leave this at 7, after a cup of tea. Shall I see you again?" "See me again? Oh, to day, you mean. Indeed you shall. Not see you off? My own man?" "What will they say at the office?" "I don't care what they say. Let them say what they like. I have never been absent a day yet without leave." "What time shall I be here?" Then he named an hour. "Of course I will have your last words. Perhaps you will tell me something that I must do." "I must leave some money with you." "No, not yet. That shall come after." This she said smiling up at him, with a sparkle of a tear in each eye, but with such a smile. Then he caught her in his arms and kissed her. "That may come at present, at any rate," he said. To this, though it was repeated once and again, there was no opposition. Then, in his own masterful manner, he put on his hat and stalked out of the room without any more words. She must return to the office that afternoon, of course, if only for the sake of explaining her wish to absent herself the rest of the day. But she could not go forth into the streets just yet. Though she had been able to smile at him and to return his caress, and for a moment so to stand by him that she might have something of the delight of his love, still she was too much flurried, too weak from the excitement of the last half hour to walk back to the post office without allowing herself some minutes to recruit her strength and collect her thoughts. She went at once up to her own room and cut for herself a bit of bread which she began to eat, just as one would trim one's lamp carefully for some night work, even though oppressed by heaviest sorrow, or put fuel on the fire that would be needed. Then, having fed herself, she leaned back in her chair, throwing her handkerchief over her face in order that she might think of it. Oh, how much there was to fill her mind with many thoughts! Looking back to what she had been even an hour ago, and then assuring herself with infinite delight of the certain happiness of her present position, she told herself that all the world had been altered to her within that short space. As for loving him, there was no doubt about that. Now she could own to herself that she had long since loved him, even when she thought that he might probably take that other girl as his wife. That she should love him, was it not a matter of course, he being what he was? But that he should love her, that was the marvel. But he did. She need not doubt that. She could remember distinctly each word of assurance that he had spoken to her. "I ask you because with all my heart I love you." May I not say, my girl? And if my girl, then my wife? I do not think that I like poor things, but I like you. No. If she were regarded by him as good enough to be his wife, then she would certainly never call herself a poor thing again. In her troubles and her poverty, especially in her solitude, she had often thought of that other older man who had wanted to make her his wife, sometimes almost with regret. There would have been duties for her, and a home, and a mode of life more fitting to her feminine nature than this solitary, tedious existence. And there would have been something for her to love, some human being on whom to spend her human solicitude and sympathies. She had leagued herself with Sophy Wilson, and she had been true to the bond, but it had had in it but little satisfaction. The other life, she had sometimes thought, would have been better. But she had never loved the man, and could not have loved him as a husband should, she thought, be loved by his wife. She had done what was right in refusing the good things which he had offered her, and now she was rewarded. Now had come to her the bliss of which she had dreamed, that of belonging to a man to whom she felt that she was bound by all the cords of her heart. Then she repeated his name to herself, Abraham Hall, and tried in a lowest whisper the sound of that other name, Lucy Hall. And she opened her arms wide as she sat upon the chair, as though in that way she could take his child to her bosom. She had been sitting so nearly an hour when she started up suddenly and again put on her old hat and hurried off towards her office. She felt now that as regarded her clothes she did not care about herself. There was a paradise prepared for her so dear and so near that the present was made quite bright by merely being the short path to such a future. But for his sake she cared. As belonging to him she would fain, had it been possible, not to have shown herself in a garb unfitting for his wife. Everything about him had always been decent, fitting, and serviceable. Well, it was his own doing. He had chosen her as she was. She would not run in debt to make herself fit for his notice, because such debts would have been debts to be paid by him. But if she could squeeze from her food what should supply her with garments fit at any rate to stand with him at the altar, it should be done. Then, as she hurried on to the office, she remembered what he had said about money. No! She would not have his money till it was hers of right. Then with what perfect satisfaction would she take from him whatever he pleased to give her, and how hard would she work for him in order that he might never feel that he had given her his good things for nothing. It was 5:00 before she was at the office, and she had promised to be back in the lodgings at 6 to get for him his tea. It was quite out of the question that she should work to-day. "The truth is, ma'am," she said to the female superintendent, "I have received and accepted an offer of marriage this afternoon. He is going out of town to-night, and I want to be with him before he goes." This is a plea against which official rigour cannot prevail. I remember once when a young man applied to a saturnine pundit who ruled matters in a certain office for leave of absence for a month to get married. "To get married!" said the saturnine pundit. "Poor fellow! But you must have the leave." The lady at the telegraph office was no doubt less caustic, and dismissed our Lucy for the day with congratulations rather than pity. She was back at the lodging before her lover, and had borrowed the little back parlour from Mrs. Green, and had spread the tea things, and herself made the toast in the kitchen before he came. "There's something, I suppose, more nor friendship betwixt you and Mr. Hall, and better," said the landlady, smiling. "A great deal better, Mrs. Green," Lucy had replied, with her face intent upon the toast. "I thought it never could have been that other young lady," said Mrs. Green. "And now, my dear, about money," said Abraham as he rose to prepare himself for the journey. Many things had been settled over that meal: how he was to get a house ready, and was then to say when she should come to him, and how she should bring the boy with her, and how he would have the banns called in the church, and how they would be married as soon as possible after her arrival in the new country. "And now, my dear, about money?" She had to take it at last. "Yes," she said, "it is right that I should have things fit to come to you in. It is right that you shouldn't be disgraced." "I'd marry you in a sack from the poorhouse if it was necessary," he said with vehemence. "As it is not necessary, it shall not be so. I will get things, but they shall belong to you always, and I will not wear them till the day that I also shall belong to you." She went with him that night to the station, and kissed him openly as she parted from him on the platform. There was nothing in her love now of which she was ashamed. How, after some necessary interval, she followed him down into Gloucestershire, and how she became his wife standing opposite to him in the bright raiment which his liberality had supplied, and how she became as good a wife as ever blessed a man's household, need hardly here be told. That Miss Wilson recovered her health and married the hairdresser may be accepted by all anxious readers as an undoubted fact. End of Chapter 5. End of The Telegraph Girl. Section 31 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 1. The Doctor's Family. It used to be said in the village of Beetham that nothing ever went wrong with Alice Dugdale, the meaning of which perhaps lay in the fact that she was determined that things should be made to go right. Things as they came were received by her with a gracious welcome, and things, whatever they were, seemed to be so well pleased with the treatment afforded to them that they too for the most part made themselves gracious in return. Nevertheless, she had had sorrows, as who has not? But she had kept her tears for herself, and had shown her smiles for the comfort of those around her. In this little story it shall be told how in a certain period of her life she had suffered much, how she still smiled, and how at last she got the better of her sorrow. Her father was the country doctor in the populous and straggling parish of Beetham. Beetham is one of those places so often found in the south of England, half village, half town, for the existence of which there seems to be no special reason. It had no mayor, no municipality, no market, no pavements, and no gas. It was therefore no more than a village. But it had a doctor, and Alice's father, Dr. Dugdale, was the man. He had been established at Beetham for more than 30 years, and knew every pulse and every tongue for 10 miles round. I do not know that he was very great as a doctor, but he was a kind-hearted, liberal man, and he enjoyed the confidence of the Beethamites, which is everything. For 30 years he had worked hard, and had brought up a large family without want. He was still working hard, though turned 60, at the time of which we are speaking. He had even in his old age many children dependent on him, and though he had fairly prospered, he had not become a rich man. He had been married twice, and Alice was the only child left at home by his first wife. 2 elder sisters were married, and an elder brother was away in the world. Alice had been much younger than they, and had been the only child living with him when he brought to his house a second mother for her. She was then 15. 8 or 9 years had since gone, and almost every year had brought an increase to the doctor's family. There were now 7 little Dugdales in and about the nursery, and what the 7 would do when Alice should go away, the folk of Beetham always declared that they were quite at a loss even to guess. For Mrs. Dugdale was one of those women who succumb to difficulties, who seem originally to have been made of soft material, and to have become warped, out of joint, tattered, and almost useless under the wear of the world. But Alice had been constructed of thoroughly seasoned timber, so that, let her be knocked about as she might, she was never out of repair. Now the doctor, excellent as he was at doctoring, was not very good at household matters, so that the folk at Beetham had reason to be at a loss when they bethought themselves as to what would happen when Alice should go away. Of course there is always that prospect of a girl's going away. Girls not unfrequently intend to go away. Sometimes they go away very suddenly, without any previous intention. At any rate, such a girl as Alice cannot be regarded as a fixture in a house. Binding as may be her duties at home, it is quite understood that should any adequate provocation to go away be brought within her reach, she will go, let the duties be what they may. Alice was a thoroughly good girl, good to her father, good to her little brothers and sisters, unutterably good to that poor foolish stepmother, but no doubt she would go away if duly asked. When that vista of future discomfort in the doctor's house first made itself clearly apparent to the Beethamites, an idea that Alice might perhaps go very soon had begun to prevail in the village. The eldest son of the vicar, Parson Rossiter, had come back from India as Major Rossiter, with an appointment, as some said, of £2,000 a year, let us put it down as £1,500, and had renewed his acquaintance with his old playfellow. Others, more than one or two, had endeavoured before this to entice Alice to go away, but it was said that the dark-visaged warrior, with his swarthy face and black beard and bright eyes, probably, too, something in him nobler than those outward bearings, had whispered words which had prevailed. It was supposed that Alice now had a fitting lover, and that therefore she would go away. There was no doubt in the mind of any single inhabitant of Beetham as to the quality of the lover. It was considered on all sides that he was fitting, so fitting that Alice would of course go when asked. John Rossiter was such a man that every Beethamite looked upon him as a hero, so that Beetham was proud to have produced him. In small communities a man will come up now and then as to whom it is surmised that any young lady would of course accept him. This man, who was now about 10 years older than Alice, had everything to recommend him. He was made up of all good gifts of beauty, conduct, dignity, good heart, and 1,500 a year at the very least. His official duties required him to live in London, from which Beetham was 70 miles distant, but those duties allowed him ample time for visiting the parsonage. So it was very fitting he was to take any girl away upon whom he might fix an eye of approbation, that there were others, higher than Alice in the world's standing, who were said to grudge the young lady of the village so great a prize. For Alice Dugdale was a young lady of the village, and no more, whereas there were county families round with daughters, among whom the Rossiters had been in the habit of mixing. Now that such a Rossiter had come to the fore, the parsonage family was held to be almost equal to the county people. To whatever extent Alice's love affairs had gone, she herself had been very silent about them, nor had her lover as yet taken the final step of being closeted for 10 minutes with her father. Nevertheless, everybody had been convinced in Beetham that it would be so, unless it might be Mrs. Rossiter. Mrs. Rossiter was ambitious for her son, and in this matter sympathized with the county people. The county people certainly were of the opinion that John Rossiter might do better, and did not altogether see what there was in Alice Dugdale to make such a fuss about. Of course she had a sweet countenance, rather brown, with good eyes. She had not, they said, another feature in her face which could be called handsome. Her nose was broad, her mouth was large. They did not like that perpetual dimpling of the cheek, which, if natural, looked as if it were practised. She was stout, almost stumpy, they thought. No doubt she danced well, having a good ear and being active and healthy, but with such a waist no girl could really be graceful. They acknowledged her to be the best nursemaid that ever a mother had in her family, but they thought it a pity that she should be taken away from duties for which her presence was so much desired, at any rate by such a one as John Rossiter. I, who knew Beetham well, and who, though turned the hill of middle life, had still an eye for female charms, used to declare to myself that Alice, though she was decidedly village and not county, was far, far away the prettiest girl in that part of the world. The old parson loved her, and so did Miss Rossiter, Miss Janet Rossiter, who was 4 or 5 years older than her brother, and therefore quite an old maid. But John was so great a man that neither of them dared to say much to encourage him, as neither did Mrs. Rossiter to use her eloquence on the other side. It was felt by all of them that any persuasion might have on John anything but the intended effect. When a man at the age of 33 is Deputy Assistant Inspector General of Cavalry, it is not easy to talk him this way or that in a matter of love. And John Rossiter, though the best fellow in the world, was apt to be taciturn on such a subject. Men frequently marry almost without thinking about it at all. Well, perhaps I might as well. At any rate, I cannot very well help it. That too often is the frame of mind. Rossiter's discussion to himself was of a higher nature than that, but perhaps not quite what it should have been. This is a thing of such moment that it requires to be pondered again and again. A man has to think of himself, and of her, and of the children which have to come after him, of the total good or total bad which may come of such a decision. As in the one manner there is too much of negligence, so in the other there may be too much of care. The "perhaps I might as wells," so good is Providence, are sometimes more successful than those careful, long-pondering heroes. The old parson was very sweet to Alice, believing that she would be his daughter-in-law, and so was Miss Rossiter, thoroughly approving of such a sister. But Mrs. Rossiter was a little cold, all of which Alice could read plainly and digest without saying a word. If it was to be, she would welcome her happy lot with heartfelt acknowledgment of the happiness provided for her. But if it was not to be, no human being should know that she had sorrowed. There should be nothing lackadaisical in her life or conduct. She had her work to do, and she knew that as long as she did that, grief would not overpower her. In her own house it was taken for granted that she was to go in a manner that distressed her. "You'll never be here to lengthen 'em," said her stepmother to her, almost whining, when there was a question as to flounces and certain juvenile petticoats which might require to be longer than they were first made before they should be finally abandoned. "That I certainly shall if Tiny grows as she does now." "I suppose he'll pop regularly when he next comes down," said Mrs. Dugdale. There was ever so much in this which annoyed Alice. In the first place, the word pop was to her abominable. Then she was almost called upon to deny that he would pop, when in her heart she thought it very probable that he might. And the word, she knew, had become intelligible to the eldest of her little sisters who was present. Moreover, she was most unwilling to discuss the subject at all, and could hardly leave it undiscussed when such direct questions were asked. "Mamma," she said, "don't let us think about anything of the kind." This did not at all satisfy herself. She ought to have repudiated the lover altogether, and yet she could not bring herself to tell the necessary lie. "I suppose he will come some day," said Minnie, the child old enough to understand the meaning of such coming. "For men may come and men may go, but I go on for ever, for ever," said or sang Alice, with a pretence of drollery, as she turned herself to her little sister. But even in her little song there was a purpose. Let any man come or let any man go, she would go on, at any rate apparently untroubled, in the walk of life. "Of course he'll take you away, and then what am I to do?" said Mrs. Dugdale, moaning. It is sad enough for a girl thus to have her lover thrown in her face, when she is by no means sure of her lover. A day or two afterwards, another word, much more painful, was said to her up at the parsonage. Into the parsonage she went frequently to show that there was nothing in her heart to prevent her from visiting her old friends as had been her wont. "John will be down here next week," said the parson, whom she met on the gravel drive just at the hall door. "How often he comes! What do they do at the Horse Guards, or wherever it is that he goes to?" "He'll be more steady when he has taken a wife," said the old man. "In the meantime, what becomes of the cavalry?" "I daresay you'll know all about that before long," said the parson, laughing. "Now, my dear, how can you be so foolish as to fill the girl's head with nonsense of that kind?" said Mrs. Rossiter, who at that moment came out from the front door. "And you're doing John an injustice. You are making people believe that he has said that which he has not said." Alice at the moment was very angry, as angry as she well could be. It was certain that Mrs. Rossiter did not know what her son had said or had not said, but it was cruel that she who had put forward no claim, who had never been forward in seeking her lover, should be thus almost publicly rebuked. Quiet as she wished to be, it was necessary that she should say one word in her own defence. " I don't think Mr. Rossiter's little joke will do John any injustice or me any harm," she said ;" but as it may be taken seriously, I hope he will not repeat it." " He could not do better for himself, that's my opinion," said the old man, turning back into the house. There had been words before on the subject between him and his wife, and he was not well pleased with her at this moment. " My dear Alice, I am sure you know that I mean everything the best for you," said Mrs. Rossiter. " If nobody would mean anything but just let me alone, that would be best. And as for nonsense, Mrs. Rossiter, don't you know of me that I'm not likely to be carried away by foolish ideas of that kind ?"" I do know that you are very good." " Then why should you talk at me as though I were very bad ?" Mrs. Rossiter felt that she had been reprimanded, and was less inclined than ever to accept Alice as a daughter-in-law. Alice, as she walked home, was low in spirits, and angry with herself because it was so. People would be fools. Of course that was to be expected. She had known all along that Mrs. Rossiter wanted a grander wife for her son, whereas the parson was anxious to have her for his daughter-in-law. Of course she loved the parson better than his wife. But why was it that she felt at this moment that Mrs. Rossiter would prevail? " Of course it will be so," she said to herself. " I see it now, and I suppose he is right. But then certainly he ought not to have come here. But perhaps he comes because he wishes to see Miss Wanless." She went a little out of her road home, not only to dry a tear, but to rid herself of the effect of it, and then spent the remainder of the afternoon swinging her brothers and sisters in the garden. CHAPTER II. Section 32 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 2. Major Rossiter. Perhaps he is coming here to see Miss Wanless, Alice had said to herself, and in the course of that week she found that her surmise was correct. John Rossiter stayed only one night at the parsonage, and then went over to Brook Park, where lived Sir Walter Wanless and all the Wanlesses. The parson had not so declared when he told Alice that his son was coming, but John himself said on his arrival that this was a special visit made to Brook Park and not to Beetham. It had been promised for the last 3 months, though only fixed lately. He took the trouble to come across to the doctor's house with the express purpose of explaining the fact. " I suppose you have always been intimate with them," said Mrs. Dugdale, who was sitting with Alice and a little crowd of children round them. There was a tone of sarcasm in the words, not at all hidden. " We all know that you are a great deal finer than we mere village folk. We don't know the Wanlesses, but of course you do. You'll find yourself much more at home at Brook Park than you can in such a place as this." All that, though not spoken, was contained in the tone of the lady's speech. " We have always been neighbours," said John Rossiter. " Neighbours 10 miles off," said Mrs. Dugdale. " I dare say the Good Samaritan lived 30 miles off," said Alice. " I don't think distance has much to do with it," said the Major. " I like my neighbours to be neighbourly. I like Beetham neighbours," said Mrs. Dugdale. There was a reproach in every word of it. Mrs. Dugdale had heard of Miss Georgiana Wanless, and Major Rossiter knew that she had done so. After her fashion, the lady was accusing him for deserting Alice. Alice understood it also, and yet it behoved her to hold herself well up and be cheerful. " I like Beetham people best myself," she said, " but then it is because I don't know any other. I remember going to Brook Park once, when there was a party of children, 100 years ago, and I thought it quite a paradise. There was a profusion of strawberries by which my imagination has been troubled ever since. You'll just be in time for the strawberries, Major Rossiter." He had always been John till quite lately, John with the memories of childhood, but now he had become Major Rossiter. She went out into the garden with him for a moment as he took his leave, not quite alone, as a little boy of 2 years was clinging to her hand. "If I had my way," she said, "I'd have my neighbours everywhere, at a distance. I envy a man chiefly for that." "Those one loves best should be very near, I think." "Those one loves best of all? Oh yes, so that one may do something. It wouldn't do not to have you every day, would it, Bobby?" Then she allowed the willing little urchin to struggle up into her arms and to kiss her, all smeared as was his face with bread and butter. "Your mother meant to say that I was running away from my old friends." "Of course she did. You see, you loom so very large to us here. You are such a swell, as Dick says, that we are a little sore when you pass us by. Everybody likes to be bowed to by royalty. Don't you know that? Brook Park is, of course, the proper place for you, but you don't expect but what we are going to express our little disgusts and little prides when we find ourselves left behind." No words could have less declared her own feelings on the matter than those she was uttering, but she found herself compelled to laugh at him, lest in the other direction something of tenderness might escape her, whereby he might be injured worse than by her raillery. In nothing that she might say could there be less of real reproach to him than in this. "I hate that word swell," he said. "So do I." "Then why do you use it?" "To show you how much better Brook Park is than Beetham. I am sure they don't talk about swells at Brook Park." "Why do you throw Brook Park in my teeth?" "I feel an inclination to make myself disagreeable to day. Are you never like that?" "I hope not." "And then I am bound to follow up what poor dear mamma began. But I won't throw Brook Park in your teeth. The ladies I know are very nice. Sir Walter Wanless is a little grand, isn't he?" "You know," said he, "that I should be much happier here than there." "Because Sir Walter is so grand?" "Because my friends here are dearer friends. But still it is right that I should go. One cannot always be where one would be happiest." "I am happiest with Bobby," said she, "and I can always have Bobby." Then she gave him her hand at the gate, and he went down to the parsonage. That night Mrs. Rossiter was closeted for a while with her son before they both went to bed. She was supposed in Beetham to be of a higher order of intellect, of a higher stamp generally, than her husband or daughter, and to be in that respect nearly on a par with her son. She had not travelled as he had done, but she was of an ambitious mind and had thoughts beyond Beetham. The poor dear parson cared for little outside the bounds of his parish. "I am so glad you are going to stay for a while over at Brook Park," she said. "Only for 3 days." "In the intimacy of a house 3 days is a lifetime. Of course I do not like to interfere." When this was said the Major frowned, knowing well that his mother was going to interfere. "But I cannot help thinking how much a connection with the Wanlesses would do for you." "I don't want anything from any connection." "That is all very well, John, for a man to say, but in truth we all depend on connections one with another. You are beginning the world." "I don't know about that, mother." "To my eyes you are. Of course you look upwards." "I take all that as it comes." "No doubt, but still you must have it in your mind to rise. A man is much assisted very much by the kind of wife he marries. Much would be done for a son-in-law of Sir Walter Wanless." "Nothing, I hope, ever for me on that score. To succeed by favour is odious." "But even to rise by merit, so much outside assistance is often necessary. Though you will assuredly deserve all that you will ever get, yet you may be more likely to get it as a son-in-law to Sir Walter Wanless than if you were married to some obscure girl. Men who make the most of themselves in the world do think of these things. I am the last woman in the world to recommend my boy to look after money in marriage." "The Miss Wanlesses will have none." and therefore I can speak the more freely. They will have very little, as coming from such a family. But he has great influence. He has contested the county 5 times. And then, where is there a handsomer girl than Georgiana Wanless? The Major thought he knew one, but he did not answer the question. And she is all that such a girl ought to be. Her manners are perfect, and her conduct. A constant performance of domestic duties is of course admirable. If it comes to one to have to wash linen, she who washes her linen well is a good woman. But among mean things high spirits are not to be found. I am not so sure of that. It must be so. How can the employment of every hour in the day on menial work leave time for the mind to fill itself? Making children's frocks may be a duty, but it must also be an impediment. You are speaking of Alice. Of course I am speaking of Alice. I would wager my head that she has read twice more in the last 2 years than Georgiana Wanless. But, mother, I am not disposed to discuss either the one young lady or the other. I am not going to Brook Park to look for a wife, and if I ever take one, it will be simply because I like her best, and not because I wish to use her as a rung of a ladder by which to climb upwards into the world. That all this and just this would be said to her, Mrs. Rossiter had been aware, but still she had thought that a word in season might have its effect. And it did have its effect. John Rossiter, as he was driven over to Brook Park on the following morning, was unconsciously mindful of that allusion to the washerwoman. He had seen that Alice's cheek had been smirched by the greasy crumbs from her little brother's mouth. He had seen that the tips of her fingers showed the mark of the needle. He had seen fragments of thread about her dress, and the mud even from the children's boots on her skirts. He had seen this, and had been aware that Georgiana Wanless was free from all such soil on her outward raiment. He liked the perfect grace of unspotted feminine apparel, and he had, too, thought of the hours in which Alice might probably be employed amidst the multifarious needs of a nursery, and had argued to himself much as his mother had argued. It was good and homely, worthy of 1,000 praises, but was it exactly that which he wanted in a wife? He had repudiated with scorn his mother's cold, worldly doctrine, but yet he had felt that it would be a pleasant thing to have it known in London that his wife was the daughter of Sir Walter Wanless. It was true that she was wonderfully handsome, a complexion perfectly clear, a nose cut as out of marble, a mouth delicate as of a goddess, with a waist quite to match it. Her shoulders were white as alabaster. Her dress was at all times perfect. Her fingers were without mark or stain. There might perhaps be a want of expression, but faces so symmetrical are seldom expressive. And then, to crown all this, he was justified in believing that she was attached to himself. Almost as much had been said to him by Lady Wanless herself, a word which would amount to as much, coupled as it was with an immediate invitation to Brook Park. Of this he had given no hint to any human being, but he had been at Brook Park once before, and some rumour of something between him and Miss Georgiana Wanless had reached the people at Beetham, had reached, as we have seen, not only Mrs. Rossiter, but also Alice Dugdale. There had been moments up in London when his mind had veered round towards Miss Wanless. But there was one little trifle which opposed the action of his mind, and that was his heart. He had begun to think that it might be his duty to marry Georgiana, but the more he thought so, the more clearly would the figure of Alice stand before him, so that no veil could be thrown over it. When he tried to summon to his imagination the statuesque beauty of the one girl, the bright eyes of the other would look at him, and the words from her speaking mouth would be in his ears. He had once kissed Alice, immediately on his return, in the presence of her father, and the memory of the halcyon moment was always present to him. When he thought most of Miss Wanless, he did not think much of her kisses. How grand she would be at his dining table, how glorious in his drawing room! But with Alice, how sweet would it be to sit by some brookside and listen to the waters. And now, since he had been at Beetham, from the nature of things which sometimes make events to come from exactly contrary causes, a new charm had been added to Alice, simply by the little effort she had made to annoy him. She had talked to him of swells, and had pretended to be jealous of the Wanlesses, just because she had known that he would hate to hear such a word from her lips, and that he would be vexed by exhibition of such a feeling on her part. He was quite sure that she had not committed these sins because they belonged to her as a matter of course. Nothing could be more simple than her natural language or her natural feelings. But he had chosen to show him that she was ready to run into little faults which might offend him. The reverse of her ideas came upon him. She had said, as it were, "See how little anxious I must be to dress myself in your mirror when I put myself in the same category with my poor stepmother." Then he said to himself that he could see her as he was fain to see her in her own mirror, and he loved her the better because she had dared to run the risk of offending him. As he was driven up to the house at Brook Park, he knew that it was his destiny to marry either the one girl or the other, and he was afraid of himself, that before he left the house he might be engaged to the one he did not love. There was a moment in which he thought he would turn round and go back. "Major Rossiter," Lady Wanless had said, "you know how glad we are to see you here. There is no young man of the day of whom Sir Walter thinks so much." Then he had thanked her. "But may I say a word in warning?" "Certainly." "And may I trust to your honour?" "I think so, Lady Wanless." "Do not be much with that sweet darling of mine, unless, indeed—" And then she had stopped. Major Rossiter, though he was a major, and had served some years in India, blushed up to his eyebrows and was unable to answer a word. But he knew that Georgiana Wanless had been offered to him, and was entitled to believe that the young lady was prone to fall in love with him. Lady Wanless, had she been asked for an excuse for such conduct, would have said that the young men of the present day were slow in managing their own affairs unless a little help were given to them. When the Major was almost immediately invited to return to Brook Park, he could not but feel that if he were so to make his choice, he would be received there as a son-in-law. It may be that unless he intended so to be received, he should not have gone. This he felt as he was driven across the park, and was almost minded to return to Beetham. End of chapter 2. Section 33 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 3. Lady Wanless. Sir Walter Wanless was one of those great men who never do anything great, but achieve their greatness partly by their tailors, partly by a breadth of eyebrow and carriage of the body, what we may call deportment, and partly by the outside gifts of fortune. Taking his career altogether, we must say that he had been unfortunate. He was a baronet with a fine house and park, and with an income hardly sufficient for the place. He had contested the county 4 times on old Whig principles, and had once been in Parliament for 2 years. There he had never opened his mouth, but in his struggle to get there had greatly embarrassed his finances. His tailor had been well chosen, and had always turned him out as the best dressed old baronet in England. His eyebrow was all his own, and certainly commanded respect from those with whom eyebrows are efficacious. He never read, he eschewed farming, by which he had lost money in early life, and had, so to say, no visible occupation at all. But he was Sir Walter Wanless, and what with his tailor and what with his eyebrow, he did command a great deal of respect in the country round Beetham. He had, too, certain good gifts for which people were thankful as coming from so great a man. He paid his bills, he went to church, he was well behaved, and still maintained certain old-fashioned family charities, though money was not plentiful with him. He had 2 sons and 5 daughters. The sons were in the army and were beyond his control. The daughters were all at home, and were altogether under the control of their mother. Indeed, everything at Brook Park was under the control of Lady Wanless, though no man alive gave himself airs more autocratic than Sir Walter. It was on her shoulders that fell the burden of the 5 daughters, and of maintaining with straitened means the hospitality of Brook Park on their behoof. A hard-worked woman was Lady Wanless in doing her duty, with imperfect lights no doubt, but to the best of her abilities with such lights as she possessed. She was somewhat fine in her dress, not for any comfort that might accrue to herself, but from a feeling that an alliance with the Wanlesses would not be valued by the proper sort of young men unless she were grand herself. The girls were beautifully dressed, but oh, with such care and economy and daily labour among them, herself, and the 2 ladies' maids upstairs. The father, what with his election and his farming, and a period of costly living early in his life, had not done well for the family. That she knew, and never rebuked him. But it was for her to set matters right, which she could do only by getting husbands for the daughters. That this might be achieved, the Wanless prestige must be maintained, and with crippled means it is so hard to maintain a family prestige. A poor duke may do it, or perhaps an earl, but a baronet is not high enough to give bad wines to his guests without serious detriment to his unmarried daughters. A beginning to what might be hoped to be a long line of successes had already been made. The eldest girl, Sophia, was engaged. Lady Wanless did not look very high, knowing that failure in such operations will bring with it such unutterable misfortune. Sophia was engaged to the eldest son of a neighbouring squire, whose property indeed was not large, nor was the squire likely to die very soon, but there were the means of present living and a future rental of £4,000 a year. Young Mr. Cobble was now staying at the house, and had been duly accepted by Sir Walter himself. The youngest girl, who was only 19, had fallen in love with a young clergyman in the neighbourhood. That would not do at all, and the young clergyman was not allowed within the park. Georgiana was the beauty, and for her, if for any, some great destiny might have been hoped. But it was her turn, a matter of which Lady Wanless thought a great deal, and the Major was too good to be allowed to escape. Georgiana, in her cold, impassive way, seemed to like the Major, and therefore Lady Wanless paired them off instantly with that decision which was necessary amidst the labours of her life. She had no scruples in what she did, feeling sure that her daughters would make honest, good wives, and that the blood of the Wanlesses was a dowry in itself. The Major had been told to come early because a party was made to visit certain ruins about 8 miles off, Castle Owless as it was called, to which Lady Wanless was accustomed to take her guests, because the family history declared that the Wanlesses had lived there at some very remote period. It still belonged to Sir Walter, though unfortunately the intervening lands had for the most part fallen into other hands. Owless and Wanless were supposed to be the same, and thus there was room for a good deal of family tattle. " I am delighted to see you at Brook Park," said Sir Walter as they met at the luncheon table. " When I was at Christchurch your father was at Wadham, and I remember him well." Exactly the same words had been spoken when the Major, on a former occasion, had been made welcome at the house, and clearly implied a feeling that Christchurch, though much superior, may condescend to know Wadham, under certain circumstances. Of the baronet nothing further was heard or seen till dinner. Lady Wanless went in the open carriage with 3 daughters, Sophy being one of them. As her affair was settled, it was not necessary that one of the 2 side saddles should be allotted to her use. Young Cobble, who had been asked to send 2 horses over from Cobble Hall so that Rossiter might ride one, felt this very hard. But there was no appeal from Lady Wanless. " You'll have plenty enough of her all the evening," said the mother, patting him affectionately, "and it is so necessary just at present that Georgiana and Edith should have horse exercise." In this way it was arranged that Georgiana should ride with the Major, and Edith, the third daughter, with young Burmeston, the son of Cox and Burmeston, brewers at the neighbouring town of Slowbridge. A country brewer is not quite what Lady Wanless would have liked, but with difficulties such as hers a rich young brewer might be worth having. All this was hard upon Mr. Cobble, who would not have sent his horses over if he had known it. Our Major saw at a glance that Georgiana rode well. He liked ladies to ride, and doubted whether Alice had ever been on horseback in her life. After all, how many advantages does a girl lose by having to pass her days in a nursery? For a moment some such idea crossed his mind. Then he asked Georgiana some question as to the scenery through which they were passing. "Very fine indeed," said Georgiana. She looked square before her, and sat with her back square to the horse's tail. There was no hanging in the saddle, no shifting about in uneasiness. She could rise and fall easily, even gracefully, when the horse trotted. "You are fond of riding, I can see," said the Major. "I do like riding," answered Georgiana. The tone in which she spoke of her present occupation was much more lively than that in which she had expressed her approbation of scenery. At the ruin they all got down, and Lady Wanless told them the entire story of the Owlesses and the Wanlesses, and filled the brewer's mind with wonder as to the antiquity and dignity of the family. But the Major was the fish, just at this moment in hand. "The Rossiters are very old too," she said, smiling, "but perhaps that is a kind of thing you don't care for." "Very much indeed," said he. Which was true, for he was proud of knowing that he had come from the Rossiters who had been over 400 years in Herefordshire. A remembrance of old merit will always be an incitement to new. "It is just that, Major Rossiter. It is strange how very nearly in the same words Georgiana said the same thing to me yesterday." Georgiana happened to overhear this, but did not contradict her mother, though she made a grimace to her sister, which was seen by no one else. Then Lady Wanless slipped aside to assist the brewer and Edith, leaving the Major and her second daughter together. The two younger girls, of whom the youngest was the wicked one with the penchant for the curate, were wandering among the ruins by themselves. "I wonder whether there were ever any people called Owless," said Rossiter, not quite knowing what subject of conversation to choose. "Of course there were. Mamma always says so." "That settles the question, does it not?" "I don't see why there shouldn't be Owlesses. No, I won't sit on the wall, thank you, because I should stain my habit." "But you'll be tired." "Not particularly tired. It is not so very far. I'd go back in the carriage, only of course we can't because of the habits. Oh yes, I'm very fond of dancing, very fond indeed. We always have 2 balls every year at Slowbridge, and there are some others about the county. I don't think you ever have balls at Beetham." "There is no one to give them." "Does Miss Dugdale ever dance?" The Major had to think for a moment before he could answer the question. Why should Miss Wanless ask as to Alice's dancing? "I am sure she does. Now I think of it, I have heard her talk of dancing. You don't know Alice Dugdale?" Miss Wanless shook her head. "She is worth knowing." "I am quite sure she is. I have always heard that you thought so. She is very good to all those children, isn't she?" "Very good indeed." "She would be almost pretty if she weren't so dumpy, I should say." Then they got on their horses again and rode back to Brook Park. Let Georgiana be ever so tired, she did not show it, but rode in under the portico with perfect equestrian grace. "I am afraid you took too much out of her," said Lady Wanless to the Major that evening. Georgiana had gone to bed a little earlier than the others. This was in some degree hard upon him, as he had not proposed the ride, and he excused himself. "It was you arranged it all, Lady Wanless." "Yes, indeed," said she, smiling. "I did arrange the little excursion, but it was not I who kept her talking the whole day." Now this again was felt to be unfair, as nearly every word of conversation between the young people has been given in this little chronicle. On the following day the young people were again thrust together, and before they parted for the night another little word was spoken by Lady Wanless, which indicated very clearly that there was some special bond of friendship between the Major and her second daughter. " You are quite right," she had said, in answer to some extracted compliment. " She does ride very well. When I was up in town in May, I thought I saw no one with such a seat in the Row. Miss Green, who taught the Duchess of Ditchwater's daughters, declared that she knew nothing like it." On the third morning he returned to Beetham early, as he intended to go up to town the same afternoon. Then there was prepared for him a little valedictory opportunity in which he could not but press the young lady's fingers for a moment. As he did so no one was looking at him, but then he knew it was so much the more dangerous because no one was looking. Nothing could be more knowing than the conduct of the young lady, who was not in any way too forward. If she admitted that slight pressure, it was done with a retiring rather than obtrusive favour. It was not by her own doing that she was alone with him for a moment. There was no casting down or casting up of her eyes. And yet it seemed to him as he left her and went out into the hall that there had been so much between them that he was almost bound to propose to her. In the hall there was the Baronet to bid him farewell, an honour which he did to his guests only when he was minded to treat them with great distinction. " Lady Wanless and I are delighted to have had you here," he said. " Remember me to your father, and tell him that I remember him very well when I was at Christchurch and he was at Wadham." It was something to have had one's hand taken in so paternal a manner by a baronet with such an eyebrow and such a coat. And yet when he returned to Beetham he was not in a good humour with himself. It seemed to him that he had been almost absorbed among the Wanlesses without any action or will of his own. He tried to comfort himself by declaring that Georgiana was, without doubt, a remarkably handsome young woman, and that she was a perfect horsewoman, as though all that were a matter to him of any moment. Then he went across to the doctor's house to say a word of farewell to Alice. " Have you had a pleasant visit ?" she asked. " Oh yes, all very well." " That second Miss Wanless is quite beautiful, is she not ?"" She is handsome, certainly." " I call her lovely," said Alice. " You rode with her the other day over to the old castle." Who could have told this of him already? " Yes, there was a party of us went over." " When are you going there again ?" Now something had been said of a further visit, and Rossiter had almost promised that he would return. It is impossible not to promise when undefined invitations are given. A man cannot declare that he is engaged for ever and ever. But how was it that Alice knew all that had been said and done? " I cannot say that I have fixed any exact day," he replied almost angrily. " I've heard all about you, you know. That young Mr. Burmeston was at Mrs. Tweed's and told them what a favourite you are. If it be true I will congratulate you, because I do really think that the young lady is the most beautiful that I ever saw in my life." This she said with a smile and a good humoured little shake of the head. If it was to be that her heart must be broken, he at least should not know it. And she still hoped, she still thought, that by being very constant at her work she might get over it. CHAPTER IV. Section 34 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 4. The Beethamites. It was told all through Beetham before a week was over that Major Rossiter was to marry the second Miss Wanless, and Beetham liked the news. Beetham was proud that one of her sons should be introduced into the great neighbouring family, and especially that he should be honoured by the hand of the acknowledged beauty. Beetham a month ago had declared that Alice Dugdale, a Beethamite herself from her babyhood, who had been born and bred at Beetham and had ever lived there, was to be honoured by the hand of the young hero. But it may be doubted whether Beetham had been altogether satisfied with the arrangement. We are apt to envy the good luck of those who have always been familiar with us. Why should it have been Alice Dugdale any more than one of the Tweed girls, or Miss Simpkins, the daughter of the attorney, who would certainly have a snug little fortune of her own, which unfortunately would not be the case with Alice Dugdale? It had been felt that Alice was hardly good enough for their hero, Alice who had been seen about with all the Dugdale children, pushing them in perambulators almost every day since the eldest was born. We prefer the authority of a stranger to that of one chosen from among ourselves. As the two Miss Tweeds and Miss Simpkins, with Alice and 3 or 4 others, could not divide the hero among them, it was better then that the hero should go from among them and choose a fitting mate in a higher realm. They all felt the greatness of the Wanlesses, and argued with Mrs. Rossiter that the rising star of the village should obtain such assistance in rising as would come to him from an almost noble marriage. There had been certainly a decided opinion that Alice was to be the happy woman. Mrs. Dugdale, the stepmother, had boasted of the promotion, and old Mr. Rossiter had whispered his secret conviction into the ear of every favoured parishioner. The doctor himself had allowed his patients to ask questions about it. This had become so common that Alice herself had been inwardly indignant, would have been outwardly indignant, but that she could not allow herself to discuss the matter. That having been so, Beetham ought to have been scandalized by the fickleness of her hero. Beetham ought to have felt that her hero was most unheroic. But, at any rate among the ladies, there was no shadow of such a feeling. Of course, such a man as the Major was bound to do the best for himself. The giving away of his hand in marriage was a very serious thing, and was not to be obligatory on a young hero because he had been carried away by the fervour of old friendship to kiss a young lady immediately on his return home. The history of the kiss was known all over Beetham, and was declared by competent authorities to have amounted to nothing. It was a last lingering touch of childhood's happy embracings, and if Alice was such a fool as to take it for more, she must pay the penalty of her folly. It was in her father's presence, said Mrs. Rossiter, defending her son to Mrs. Tweed, and Mrs. Tweed had expressed her opinion that the kiss ought to go for nothing. The Major was to be acquitted, and the fact of the acquittal made its way even to the doctor's nursery, so that Alice knew that the man might marry that girl at Brook Park with clean hands. That, as she declared to herself, did not increase her sorrow. If the man were minded to marry the girl, he was welcome for her. And she apologized for him to her own heart. What a man generally wants, she said, is a beautiful wife, and of the beauty of Miss Georgiana Wanless there could be no doubt. Only there had been a dozen words which he should have left unspoken. That which riveted the news on the minds of the Beethamites was the stopping of the Brook Park carriage at the door of the parsonage one day about a week after the Major's visit. It was not altogether an unprecedented occurrence. Had there been no precedent, it could hardly have been justified on the present occasion. Perhaps once in 2 years Lady Wanless would call at the parsonage, and then there would be a return visit during which a reference would always be made to Wadham and Christchurch. The visit was now out of its order, only 9 months having elapsed, of which irregularity Beetham took due notice. On this occasion Miss Wanless and the 3rd young lady accompanied their mother, leaving Georgiana at home. What was whispered between the 2 old ladies Beetham did not quite know, but made its surmises. It was in this wise. "We were so glad to have the Major over with us," said her ladyship. "It was so good of you," said Mrs. Rossiter. "He is a great favourite with Sir Walter." "That is so good of Sir Walter." "And we are quite pleased to have him among our young people." That was all, but it was quite sufficient to tell Mrs. Rossiter that John might have Georgiana Wanless for the asking, and that Lady Wanless expected him to ask. Then the parting was much more affectionate than it had ever been before, and there was a squeezing of the hand and a nodding of the head which meant a great deal. Alice held her tongue and did her work, and attempted to be cheery through it all. Again and again she asked herself, what did it matter? Even though she were unhappy, even though she felt a keen, palpable, perpetual aching at her heart, what would it matter so long as she could go about and do her business? Some people in this world had to be unhappy, perhaps most people, and this was a sorrow which, though it might not wear off, would by wearing become dull enough to be bearable. She distressed herself in that there was any sorrow. Providence had given to her a certain condition of life to which many charms were attached. She thoroughly loved the people about her, her father, her little brothers and sisters, even her overworn and somewhat idle stepmother. She was a queen in the house, a queen among her busy toils, and she liked being a queen and liked being busy. No one ever scolded her or crossed her or contradicted her. She had the essential satisfaction of the consciousness of usefulness. Why should not that suffice to her? She despised herself because there was a hole in her heart, because she felt herself to shrink all over when the name of Georgiana Wanless was mentioned in her hearing. Yet she would mention the name herself and speak with something akin to admiration of the Wanless family. And she would say how well it was that men should strive to rise in the world, and how that the world progressed through such individual efforts. But she would not mention the name of John Rossiter, nor would she endure that it should be mentioned in her hearing with any special reference to herself. Mrs. Dugdale, though she was overworn and idle, a warped and almost useless piece of furniture made, as was said before, of bad timber, yet saw more of this than any one else, and was indignant. To lose Alice, to have no one to let down those tucks and take up those stitches, would be to her the loss of all her comforts. But though she was feckless, she was true-hearted, and she knew that Alice was being wronged. It was Alice that had a right to the hero, and not that stuck-up young woman at Brook Park. It was thus she spoke of the affair to the doctor, and after a while found herself unable to be silent on the subject to Alice herself. If what they say does take place, I shall think worse of John Rossiter than I ever did of any man I ever knew. This she said in the presence both of her husband and her stepdaughter. John Rossiter will not be very much the worse for that, said Alice, without relaxing a moment from her work. There was a sound of drolling in her voice, as though she were quizzing her stepmother for her folly. It seems to me that men may do anything now, continued Mrs. Dugdale. I suppose they are the same now as they always were, said the doctor. If a man chose to be false, he could always be false. I call it unmanly, said Mrs. Dugdale. If I were a man, I would beat him. What would you beat him for? Said Alice, getting up, and as she did so throwing down on the table before her the little frock she was making. If you had the power of beating him, why would you beat him? Because he is ill-using you. How do you know that? Did I ever tell you so? Have you ever heard a word that he has said to me, either direct from himself or second-hand, that justifies you in saying that he has ill-used me? You ill-use me when you speak like that. Alice, do not be so violent, said the doctor. Father, I will speak of this once, and once for all. And then pray, pray, let there be no further mention of it. I have no right to complain of anything in Major Rossiter. He has done me no wrong. Those who love me should not mention his name in reference to me. He is a villain, said Mrs. Dugdale. He is no villain. He is a gentleman, as far as I know, from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot. Does it ever occur to you how little you make of me when you talk of him in this way? Dismiss it all from your mind, father, and let things be as they were. Do you think that I am pining for any man's love? I say that Major Rossiter is a true man and a gentleman, but I would not give my Bobby's little finger for all his whole body. Then there was silence, and afterwards the doctor told his wife that the Major's name had better not be mentioned again among them. Alice, on this occasion, was, or appeared to be, very angry with Mrs. Dugdale, But on that evening and the next morning there was an accession of tenderness in her usually sweet manner to her stepmother. The expression of her mother's anger against the Major had been wrong, but the feeling of anger was not the less endearing. Some time after that, one evening, the parson came upon Alice as she was picking flowers in one of the Beetham lanes. She had all the children with her, and was filling Minnie's apron with roses from the hedge. Old Mr. Rossiter stopped and talked to them, and after a while succeeded in getting Alice to walk on with him. "You haven't heard from John?" he said. "Oh, no," replied Alice, almost with a start. And then she added quickly, "There is no one at our house likely to hear from him. He does not write to any one there." "I did not know whether any message might have reached you." "I think not." "He is to be here again before long," said the parson. "Oh, indeed?" She had but a moment to think of it all, but after thinking she continued, "I suppose he will be going over to Brook Park?" "I fear he will." "Fear? Why should you fear, Mr. Rossiter? If that is true, it is the place where he ought to be." "But I doubt its truth, my dear." "Ah, I know nothing about that. If so, he had better stay up in London, I suppose." "I don't think John can care much for Miss Wanless." "Why not? She is the most thoroughly beautiful young woman I ever saw." "I don't think he does, because I believe his heart is elsewhere. Alice, you have his heart." "No." "I think so, Alice." "No, Mr. Rossiter, I have not. It is not so. I know nothing of Miss Wanless, but I can speak of myself." "It seems to me that you are speaking of him now." "Then why does he go there?" "That is just what I cannot answer. Why does he go there? Why do we do the worst thing so often when we see the better?" "But we don't leave undone the thing which we wish to do, Mr. Rossiter." "That is just what we do, under constraint. Alice, I hope that you may become his wife." She endeavoured to deny that it could ever be so. She strove to declare that she herself was much too heart-free for that, but the words would not come to her lips, and she could only sob while she struggled to restrain her tears. "If he does come to you, give him a chance again, even though he may have been untrue to you for a moment." Then she was left alone among the children. She could dry her tears and suppress her sobs, because Minnie was old enough to know the meaning of them if she saw them, but she could not for a while go back into the house. She left them in the passage, and then went out again, and walked up and down a little pathway that ran through the shrubs at the bottom of the garden. "I believe his heart is elsewhere." Could it be that it was so? And if so, of what nature can be a man's love, if, when it be given in one direction, he can go in another with his hand? She could understand that there had not been much heart in it, that he, being a man and not a woman, could have made this turning point of his life an affair of calculation, and had taken himself here or there without much love at all; that as he would seek a commodious house, so would he also a convenient wife. Resting on that suggestion to herself, she had dared to declare to her father and mother that Major Rossiter was, not a villain, but a perfect gentleman. But all that was not compatible with his father's story. "Alice, you have his heart," the old man had said. How had it come to pass that the old man had known it? And yet the assurance was so sweet, so heavenly, so laden to her ears with divine music, that at this moment she would not even ask herself to disbelieve it. "If he does come to you, give him a chance again." Why, yes. Though she never spoke a word of Miss Wanless without praise, though she had tutored herself to swear that Miss Wanless was the very wife for him, yet she knew herself too well not to know that she was better than Miss Wanless. For his sake she could with a clear conscience give him a chance again. The dear old parson! He had seen it all. He had known. He had appreciated. If it should ever come to pass that she was to be his daughter-in-law, he should have his reward. She would not tell herself that she expected him to come again, but if he did come, she would give the parson his chance. Such was her idea at that moment, but she was forced to change it before long. End of Chapter 4. Section 35 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 5. The Invitation. When Major Rossiter discussed his own conduct with himself, as men are so often compelled to do by their own conscience, in opposition to their own wishes, he was not well pleased with himself. On his return home from India, he had found himself possessed of a liberal income, and had begun to enjoy himself without thinking much about marrying. It is not often that a man looks for a wife because he has made up his mind that he wants the article. He roams about unshackled till something which at the time seems to be altogether desirable presents itself to him, and then he meditates marriage. So it had been with our Major. Alice had presented herself to him as something altogether desirable, a something which, when it was touched and looked at, seemed to be so full of sweetnesses that to him it was for the moment of all things the most charming. He was not a forward man, one of those who can see a girl for the first time on a Monday and propose to her on the Tuesday. When the idea first suggested itself to him of making Alice his wife, he became reticent and undemonstrative. The kiss had in truth meant no more than Mrs. Tweed had said. When he began to feel that he loved her, then he hardly dared to dream of kissing her. But though he felt that he loved her, liked, perhaps, would be fairer to say in that early stage of his feelings, better than any other woman, yet when he came to think of marriage, the importance of it all made him hesitate, and he was reminded, by little hints from others, and by words plain enough from one person, that Alice Dugdale was, after all, a common thing. There is a fitness in such matters, so said Mrs. Rossiter, and a propriety in like being married to like. Had it been his lot to be a village doctor, Alice would have suited him well. Destiny, however, had carried him, the Major, higher up, and would require him to live in London, among ornate people with polished habits and peculiar manners of their own. Would not Alice be out of her element in London? See the things among which she passed her life. Not a morsel of soap or a pound of sugar was used in the house, but what she gave it out. Her hours were passed in washing, teaching, and sewing for the children. In her very walks she was always pushing a perambulator. She was, no doubt, the doctor's daughter, but in fact she was the second Mrs. Dugdale's nursemaid. Nothing could be more praiseworthy. But there is a fitness in things, and he, the hero of Beetham, the Assistant Deputy Inspector General of the British Cavalry, might surely do better than marry a praiseworthy nursery girl. It was thus that Mrs. Rossiter argued with her son, and her arguments were not without avail. Then Georgiana Wanless had been, as it were, thrown at his head. When one is pelted with sugar plums, one can hardly resent the attack. He was clever enough to feel that he was pelted, but at first he liked the sweetmeats. A girl riding on horseback, with her back square to the horse's tail, with her reins well held, and a chimney-pot hat on her head, is an object, unfortunately, more attractive to the eyes of ordinary men than a young woman pushing a perambulator with two babies. Unfortunately, I say, because in either case the young woman should be judged by her personal merits and not by externals. But the Major declared to himself that the personal merits would be affected by the externals. A girl who had pushed a perambulator for many years would hardly have a soul above perambulators. There would be wanting the flavour of the aroma of romance, that something of poetic vagueness without which a girl can hardly be altogether charming to the senses of an appreciative lover. Then, a little later on, he asked himself whether Georgiana Wanless was romantic and poetic, whether there was much of true aroma there. but yet he thought that fate would require him to marry Georgiana Wanless, whom he certainly did not love, and to leave Alice to her perambulator, Alice, whom he certainly did love. And as he thought of this, he was ill at ease with himself. It might be well that he should give up his assistant deputy inspector generalship, go back to India, and so get rid of his two troubles together. Fate, as he personified fate to himself in this matter, took the form of Lady Wanless. It made him sad to think that he was but a weak creature in the hands of an old woman who wanted to use him for a certain purpose. But he did not see his way of escaping. When he began to console himself by reflecting that he would have one of the handsomest women in London at his dinner table, he knew that he would be unable to escape. About the middle of July he received the following letter from Lady Wanless. Dear Major Rossiter, the girls have been at their father for the last 10 days to have an archery meeting on the lawn, and have at last prevailed, though Sir Walter has all a father's abhorrence to have the lawn knocked about. Now it is settled. I'll see about it, Sir Walter said at last, and when so much as that had been obtained, they all knew that the archery meeting was to be. Sir Walter likes his own way, and is not always to be persuaded. But when he has made the slightest show of concession, he never goes back from it. Then comes the question as to the day, which is now in course of discussion in full committee. In that matter Sir Walter is supposed to be excluded from any voice. It cannot matter to him what day of the week or what day of the month, said Georgiana very irreverently. It will not, however, much matter to him so long as it is all over before St. Partridge comes round. The girls one and all declared that you must be here, as one of the guests in the house. Our rooms will be mostly full of young ladies, but there will be one at any rate for you. Now, what day will suit you, or rather, what day will suit the cavalry generally? Everything must of course depend on the cavalry. The girls say that the cavalry is sure to go out of town after the 10th of August. But they would put it off for a week longer rather than not have the Inspector General. Would Wednesday, 14th, suit the cavalry? They are all reading every word of my letter as it is written, and bid me say that if Thursday or Friday in that week, or Wednesday or Thursday in the next will do better, the accommodation of the cavalry shall be consulted. It cannot be on a Monday or Saturday, because there would be some Sunday encroachment. On Tuesday we cannot get the band from Slowbridge. Now you know our great purpose and our little difficulties. One thing you cannot know, how determined we are to accommodate ourselves to the cavalry. The meeting is not to take place without the Inspector General. So let us have an early answer from that august functionary. The girls think that the inspector had better come down before the day, so as to make himself useful in preparing. Pray believe me, with Sir Walter's kind regards, yours most sincerely, Margaret Wanless. The Major felt that the letter was very flattering, but that it was false and written for a certain purpose. He could read between the lines at every sentence of it. The festival was to be got up, not at the instance of the girls, but of Lady Wanless herself, as a final trap for the catching of himself, and perhaps for Mr. Burmeston. Those irreverent words had never come from Georgiana, who was too placid to have said them. He did not believe a word of the girls looking over the writing of the letter. In all such matters Lady Wanless had more life, more energy than her daughters. All that little fun about the cavalry came from Lady Wanless herself. The girls were too like their father for such ebullitions. The little sparks of joke with which the names of the girls were connected, with which in his hearing the name of Georgiana had been specially connected, had, he was aware, their origin always with Lady Wanless. Georgiana had said this funny thing and that, but Georgiana never spoke after that fashion in his hearing. The traps were plain to his eyes, and yet he knew that he would sooner or later be caught in the traps. He took a day to think of it before he answered the letter, and meditated a military tour to Berlin just about the time. If so, he must be absent during the whole of August, so as to make his presence at the Toxopholite meeting an impossibility. And yet at last he wrote and said that he would be there. There would be something mean in flight. After all, he need not ask the girl to be his wife unless he chose to do so. He wrote a very pretty note to Lady Wanless, saying that he would be at Brook Park on the 14th, as she had suggested. Then he made a great resolution, and swore an oath to himself that he would not be caught on that occasion, and that after this meeting he would go no more either to Brook Park or to Beetham for a while. He would not marry the girl to whom he was quite indifferent, nor her who from her position was hardly qualified to be his wife. Then he went about his duties with a quieted conscience, and wedded himself for once and for always to the cavalry. Some tidings of the doings proposed by the Wanlesses had reached the parson's ears when he told Alice in the lane that his son was soon coming down to Beetham again, and that he was again going to Brook Park. Before July was over, the tidings of the coming festivity had been spread over all that side of the county. Such a thing had not been done for many years, not since Lady Wanless had been herself a young wife, with two sisters for whom husbands had to be, and were provided. There were those who could still remember how well Lady Wanless had behaved on that occasion. Since those days hospitality on a large scale had not been rife at Brook Park, and the reason why it was so was well known. Sir Walter was determined not to embarrass himself further, and would do nothing that was expensive. It could not be but that there was great cause for such a deviation as this. Then the ladies of the neighbourhood put their heads together, and some of the gentlemen, and declared that a double stroke of business was to be done in regard to Major Rossiter and Mr. Burmeston. How great a relief that would be to the mother's anxiety if the three eldest girls could be married and got rid of all on the same day. Beetham, which was 10 miles from Brook Park, had a station of its own, whereas Slowbridge, with its own station, was only 6 miles from the house. The Major would fain have reached his destination by Slowbridge, so as to have avoided the chance of seeing Alice, were it not that his father and mother would have felt themselves aggrieved by such desertion. On this occasion his mother begged him to give them one night. She had much that she wished to say to him, and then of course he could have the parsonage horse and the parsonage phaeton to take him over to Brook Park free of expense. He did go down to Beetham, did spend an evening there, and did go on to the park without having spoken to Alice Dugdale. " Everybody says you are to marry Georgiana Wanless," said Mrs. Rossiter. " If there were no other reason why I should not, the saying of everybody would be sufficient against it." " That is unreasonable, John. The thing should be looked at itself, whether it is good or bad. It may be the case that Lady Wanless talks more than she ought to do. It may be the case that, as people say, she is looking out for husbands for her daughters. I don't know but that I should do the same if I had 5 of them on my hands, and very little means for them. And if I did, how could I get a better husband for one of them than such a one as Major John Rossiter?" Then she kissed his forehead. " I hate the kind of thing altogether," said he. He pretended to be stern, but yet he showed that he was flattered by his mother's softness. " It may well be, John, that such a match shall be desirable to them, and to you too. If so, why should there not be a fair bargain between the two of you? You know that you admire the girl." He would not deny this, lest it should come to pass hereafter that she should become his wife. "And everybody knows that as far as birth goes, there is not a family in the county stands higher. I am so proud of my boy that I wish to see him mated with the best." He reached the parsonage that evening only just before dinner, and on the next morning he did not go out of the house till the phaeton came round to take him to Brook Park. " Are you not going up to see the old doctor ?" said the parson after breakfast. " No, I think not. He is never at home, and the ladies are always surrounded by the children." " She will take it amiss," said the father, almost in a whisper. "I will go as I come back," said he, blushing as he spoke at his own falsehood. For if he held to his present purpose, he would return by Slowbridge. If fate intended that there should be nothing further between him and Alice, it would certainly be much better that they should not be brought together any more. He knew too what his father meant, and was more unwilling to take counsel from his father even than his mother. Yet he blushed because he knew he was false. "Do not seem to slight her," said the old man. "She is too good for that." Then he drove himself over to Brook Park, and as he made his way by one of the innumerable turnings out of Beetham, he saw at one of the corners Alice, still with the children and still with the perambulator. He merely lifted his hat as he passed, but he did not stop to speak to her. Chapter 6. Section 36 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 6. The Archery Meeting. The Assistant Deputy Inspector General, when he reached Brook Park, found that things were to be done on a great scale. The 2 drawing-rooms were filled with flowers, and the big dining-room was laid out for tomorrow's lunch in preparation for those who would prefer the dining-room to the tent. Rossiter was first taken into the Baronet's own room, where Sir Walter kept his guns and administered justice. "This is a terrible bore, Rossiter," he said. "It must disturb you a great deal, Sir Walter." "Oh dear, dreadfully. What would my old friend, your father, think of having to do this kind of thing, though when I was at Christchurch and he at Wadham we used to be gay enough. I'm not quite sure that I don't owe it to you." "To me, Sir Walter?" "I rather think you put the girls up to it." Then he laughed as though it were a very good joke, and told the Major where he would find the ladies. He had been expressly desired by his wife to be genial to the Major, and had been as genial as he knew how. Rossiter, as he went out onto the lawn, saw Mr. Burmeston the brewer walking with Edith, the 3rd daughter. He could not but admire the strategy of Lady Wanless when he acknowledged to himself how well she managed all these things. The brewer would not have been allowed to walk with Gertrude, the 4th daughter, nor even with Maria, the naughty girl who liked the curate, because it was Edith's turn. Edith was certainly the plainest of the family, and yet she had her turn. Lady Wanless was by far too good a mother to have favourites among her own children. He then found the mother, the eldest daughter, and Gertrude overseeing the decoration of a tent, which had been put up as an addition to the dining-room. He expected to find Mr. Cobble, to whom he had taken a liking, a nice, pleasant, frank, young country gentleman, but Mr. Cobble was not wanted for any express purpose, and might have been in the way. Mr. Cobble was landed and safe. Before long he found himself walking round the garden with Lady Wanless herself. The other girls, though they were to be his sisters, were never thrown into any special intimacy with him. "She will be down before long now that she knows you are here," said Lady Wanless. "She was fatigued a little, and I thought it better that she should lie down. She is so impressionable, you know." She was Georgiana. He knew that very well. But why should Georgiana be called she to him by her mother? Had she been in truth engaged to him, it would have been intelligible enough. But there had been nothing of the kind. As she was thus dinned into his ears, he thought of the very small amount of conversation which had ever taken place between himself and the young lady. Then there occurred to him an idea that he would tell Lady Wanless in so many words that there was a mistake. The doing so would require some courage, but he thought he could summon up manliness for the purpose, if only he could find the words and occasion. But though she were so frequently spoken of, still nothing was said which seemed to give him the opportunity required. It is hard for a man to have to reject a girl when she has been offered, but harder to do so before the offer has in truth been made. I am afraid there is a little mistake in your ideas as to me and your daughter." It was thus that he would have had to speak, and then to have endured the outpouring of her wrath, when she would have declared that the ideas were only in his own arrogant brain. He let it pass by and said nothing, and before long he was playing lawn tennis with Georgiana, who did not seem to have been in the least fatigued. "My dear, I will not have it," said Lady Wanless about an hour afterwards, coming up and disturbing the game. "Major Rossiter, you ought to know better." Whereupon she playfully took the racket out of the Major's hand. "Mamma is such an old bother," said Georgiana, as she walked back to the house with her Major. The Major had on a previous occasion perceived that the second Miss Wanless rode very well, but now he saw that she was very stout at lawn tennis. But he observed none of that peculiarity of mental or physical development which her mother had described as impressionable. Nevertheless, she was a handsome girl, and if to play at lawn tennis would help to make a husband happy, so much at any rate she could do. This took place on the day before the meeting, before the great day. When the morning came the girls did not come down early to breakfast, and our hero found himself left alone with Mr. Burmeston. "You have known the family a long time," said the Major, as they were sauntering about the gravel paths together, smoking their cigars. "No, indeed," said Mr. Burmeston. "They only took me up about 3 months ago, just before we went over to Owless. Very nice people, don't you think so?" "Very nice," said the Major. "They stand so high in the county, and all that sort of thing. Birth does go a long way, you know." "So it ought," said the Major. "And though the Baronet does not do much in the world, he has been in the House, you know. All those things help." Then the Major understood that Mr. Burmeston had looked the thing in the face, and had determined that for certain considerations it was worth his while to lead one of the Miss Wanlesses to the hymeneal altar. In this Mr. Burmeston was behaving with more manliness than he, who had almost made up his mind half a dozen times, and had never been satisfied with the way he had done it. About 12 the visitors had begun to come, and Sophia with Mr. Cobble were very soon trying their arrows together. Sophia had not been allowed to have her lover on the previous day, but was now making up for it. That was all very well, but Lady Wanless was a little angry with her eldest daughter. Her success was insured for her. Her business was done. Seeing how many sacrifices had been made to her during the last 12 months, surely now she might have been active in aiding her sisters instead of merely amusing herself. The Major was not good at archery. He was no doubt an excellent Deputy Inspector General of Cavalry, but if bows and arrows had still been the weapons used in any part of the British Army, he would not, without further instruction, have been qualified to inspect that branch. Georgiana Wanless, on the other hand, was a proficient. Such shooting as she made was marvellous to look at, and she was a very image of Diana, as with her beautiful figure and regular features, dressed up to the work, she stood with her bow raised in her hand and let twang the arrows. The circle immediately outside the bull's eye was the farthest from the mark she ever touched. But good as she was, and bad as was the Major, nevertheless they were appointed always to shoot together. After a world of failures the Major would shoot no more, but not the less did he go backwards and forwards with Georgiana when she changed from one end to the other, and found himself absolutely appointed to that task. It grew upon him during the whole day that this second Miss Wanless was supposed to be his own, almost as much as was the elder the property of Mr. Cobble. Other young men would do no more than speak to her. And when once, after the great lunch in the tent, Lady Wanless came and put her hand affectionately upon his arm, and whispered some word into his ear in the presence of all the assembled guests, he knew that the entire county had recognised him as caught. There was old Lady Deepbell there. How it was that towards the end of the day's delights Lady Deepbell got hold of him he never knew. Lady Deepbell had not been introduced to him, and yet she got hold of him. "Major Rossiter, you are the luckiest man of the day," she said to him. "Pretty well," he said, affecting to laugh. "But why so?" "She is the handsomest young woman out. There hasn't been one in London this season with such a figure." "You are altogether wrong in your surmise, Lady Deepbell." "No, no; I am right enough. I see it all. Of course the poor girl won't have any money, but then how nice it is when a gentleman like you is able to dispense with that. Perhaps they do take after their father a little, and he certainly is not bright. But upon my word I think a girl is all the better for that. What's the good of having such a lot of talky-talky?" "Lady Deepbell, you are alluding to a young lady without the slightest warrant," said the Major. "Warrant enough," said the old woman, toddling off. Then young Cobble came to him and talked to him as though he were a brother of the house. Young Cobble was an honest fellow, and quite in earnest in his matrimonial intentions. "We shall be delighted if you'll come to us on the 1st," said Cobble. The 1st, of course, meant the 1st of September. "We ain't so badly off just for a week's shooting. Sophia is to be there, and we'll get Georgiana too." The Major was fond of shooting, and would have been glad to accept the offer, but it was out of the question that he should allow himself to be taken in to Cobble Hall under a false pretext. And was it not incumbent on him to make this young man understand that he had no pretensions whatever to the hand of the second Miss Wanless? "You are very good," said he. "We should be delighted," said young Cobble. "But I fear there is a mistake. I can't say anything more about it now, because it doesn't do to name people, but there is a mistake. Only for that I should have been delighted. Good-bye." Then he took his departure, leaving young Cobble in a state of mystified suspense. The day lingered on to a great length. The archery and the lawn tennis were continued till late after the so-called lunch, and towards the evening a few couples stood up to dance. It was evident to the Major that Burmeston and Edith were thoroughly comfortable together. Gertrude amused herself well, and even Maria was contented, though the curate, as a matter of course, was not there. Sophia, with her legitimate lover, was as happy as the day and evening were long. But there came a frown upon Georgiana's brow, and when at last the Major, as though forced by destiny, asked her to dance, she refused. It had seemed to her a matter of course that he should ask her, and at last he did, but she refused. The evening with him was very long, and just as he thought that he would escape to bed, and was meditating how early he would be off on the morrow, Lady Wanless took possession of him and carried him off alone into one of the desolate chambers. "Is she very tired?" asked the anxious mother. "Is who tired?" The Major at that moment would have given 20 guineas to have been in his lodgings near St. James' Street. "My poor girl," said Lady Wanless, assuming a look of great solicitude. It was vain for him to pretend not to know who was the she intended. Yes, Miss Wanless." "Georgiana." "I think she is tired. She was shooting a great deal. Then there was a quadrille, but she didn't dance. There has been a great deal to tire young ladies." "You shouldn't have let her do so much." How was he to get out of it? What was he to say? If a man is clearly asked his intentions, he can say that he has not got any. That used to be the old fashion when a gentleman was supposed to be dilatory in declaring his purpose. But it gave the oscillating lover so easy an escape. It was like the sudden jerk of the hand of an unpractised fisherman. If the fish does not succumb at once, it goes away down the stream and is no more heard of. But from this new process there is no mode of immediate escape. "I couldn't prevent her because she is nothing to me." That would have been the straightforward answer, but one most difficult to make. "I hope she will be none the worse to morrow morning," said the Major. "I hope not, indeed. Oh, Major Rossiter!" The mother's position was also difficult, as it is of no use to play with a fish too long without making an attempt to stick the hook into his gills. "Lady Wanless." "What am I to say to you? I am sure you know my feelings. You know how sincere is Sir Walter's regard." "I am very much flattered, Lady Wanless." "That means nothing." This was true, but the Major did not mean to intend anything. "Of all my flock she is the fairest." That was true also. The Major would have been delighted to accede to the assertion of the young lady's beauty, if this might have been the end of it. "I had thought—" "Had thought what, Lady Wanless?" "If I am deceived in you, Major Rossiter, I never will believe in a man again. I have looked upon you as the very soul of honour." "I trust that I have done nothing to lessen your good opinion." "I do not know. I cannot say. Why do you answer me in this way about my child?" Then she held her hands together and looked up into his face imploringly. He owned to himself that she was a good actress. He was almost inclined to submit and to declare his passion for Georgiana. For the present that way out of the difficulty would have been so easy. "You shall hear from me to morrow morning," he said, almost solemnly. "Shall I?" she asked, grasping his hand. "Oh, my friend, let it be as I desire. My whole life shall be devoted to making you happy, you and her." Then he was allowed to escape. Lady Wanless, before she went to bed, was closeted for a while with the eldest daughter. As Sophia was now almost as good as a married woman, she was received into closer counsel than the others. "Burmeston will do," she said, "but as for that cavalry man, he means it no more than the chair." The pity was that Burmeston might have been secured without the Archery meeting, and that all the money spent on behalf of the Major should have been thrown away. CHAPter 7. Section 37 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 7. After the Party. When the Major left Brook Park on the morning after the Archery amusements, he was quite sure of this, that under no circumstances whatever would he be induced to ask Miss Georgiana Wanless to be his wife. He had promised to write a letter, and he would write one instantly. He did not conceive it possible but that Lady Wanless should understand what would be the purport of that letter, although, as she left him on the previous night, she had pretended to hope otherwise. That her hopes had not been very high we know from the words which she spoke to Sophia in the privacy of her own room. He had intended to return by Slowbridge, but when the morning came he changed his mind and went to Beetham. His reason for doing so was hardly plain, even to himself. He tried to make himself believe that the letter had better be written from Beetham, hot, as it were, from the immediate neighbourhood, than from London. But as he thought of this, his mind was crowded with ideas of Alice Dugdale. He would not propose to Alice. At this moment, indeed, he was averse to matrimony, having been altogether disgusted with female society at Brook Park. But he had to acknowledge a sterling worth about Alice, and the existence of a genuine friendship between her and himself, which made it painful to him to leave the country without other recognition than that raising of his hat when he saw her at the corner of the lane. He had behaved badly in this Brook Park affair, in having been tempted thither in opposition to those better instincts which had made Alice so pleasant a companion to him, and was ashamed of himself. He did not think that he could go back to his former ideas. He was aware that Alice must think ill of him, would not believe him to be now such as she had once thought him. England and London were distasteful to him. He would go abroad on that foreign service which he had proposed to himself. There was an opening for him to do so if he liked, and he could return to his present duties after a year or two. But he would see Alice again before he went. Thinking of all this, he drove himself back to Beetham. On that morning tidings of the successful festivities at Brook Park reached the doctor's house. Tidings of the coming festivities, then of the preparations, and at last of the festal day itself, had reached Alice, so that it seemed to her that all Beetham talked of nothing else. Old Lady Deepbell had caught a cold, walking about on the lawn with hardly anything on her old shoulders, stupid old woman, and had sent for the doctor the first thing in the morning. "Positively settled," she had said to the doctor. "Absolutely arranged, Dr. Dugdale. Lady Wanless told me so herself, and I congratulated the gentleman." She did not go on to say that the gentleman had denied the accusation, but then she had not believed the denial. The doctor, coming home, had thought it his duty to tell Alice, and Alice had received the news with a smile. "I knew it would be so, father." "And you?" This he said, holding her hand and looking tenderly into her eyes. "Me? It will not hurt me. Not that I mean to tell a lie to you, father," she added after a moment. "A woman isn't hurt because she doesn't get a prize in the lottery. Had it ever come about, I dare say I should have liked him well enough." "No more than that?" "And why should it have come about?" she went on saying, avoiding her father's last question, determined not to lie if she could help it, but determined also to show no wound. "I think my position in life very happy, but it isn't one from which he would choose a wife." "Why not, my dear?" "1,000 reasons. I am always busy, and he would naturally like a young lady who had nothing to do." She understood the effect of the perambulator and the constant needle and thread. "Besides, though he might be all very well, he could never, I think, be as dear to me as the bairns. I should feel that I lost more than I got by going." This she knew to be a lie, but it was so important that her father should believe her to be contented with her home duties. And she was contented, though very unhappy. When her father kissed her, she smiled into his face, oh, so sweetly, so pleasantly. And the old man thought that she could not have loved very deeply. Then she took herself to her own room and sat a while alone with a countenance much changed. The lines of sorrow about her brow were terrible. There was not a tear, but her mouth was close pressed, and her hand was working constantly by her side. She gazed at nothing, but sat with her eyes wide open, staring straight before her. Then she jumped up quickly, and striking her hand upon her heart, she spoke aloud to herself. "I will cure it," she said. "He is not worthy, and it should therefore be easier. Though he were worthy, I would cure it. Yes, Bobby, I am coming." Then she went about her work. That might have been about noon. It was after their early dinner with the children that the Major came up to the doctor's house. He had reached the parsonage in time for a late breakfast, and had written his letter. After that he had sat idling about on the lawn, not on the best terms with his mother, to whom he had sworn that under no circumstances would he make Georgiana Wanless his wife. "I would sooner marry a girl from a troop of tight-rope dancers," he had said in his anger. Mrs. Rossiter knew that he intended to go up to the doctor's house, and therefore the immediate feeling between the mother and son was not pleasant. My readers, if they please, shall see the letter to Lady Wanless. My dear Lady Wanless, it is a great grief to me to say that there has been, I fear, a misconception between you and me on a certain matter. This is the more a trouble to me because you and Sir Walter have been so very kind to me. From a word or two which fell from you last night, I was led to fear that you suspected feelings on my part which I have never entertained, and aspirations to which I have never pretended. No man can be more alive than I am to the honour which has been suggested, but I feel bound to say that I am not in a condition to accept it. Pray believe me to be, dear Lady Wanless, yours always very faithfully, John Rossiter. The letter, when it was written, was to himself very unsatisfactory. It was full of ambiguous words and namby-pamby phraseology which disgusted him, but he did not know how to alter it for the better. It is hard to say an uncivil thing civilly without ambiguous namby-pamby language. He could not bring it out in straightforward, stout English. "You want me to marry your daughter, but I won't do anything of the kind." So the letter was sent. The conduct of which he was really ashamed did not regard Miss Wanless, but Alice Dugdale. At last, very slowly, he took himself up to the doctor's house. He hardly knew what it was that he meant to say when he found himself there, but he was sure that he did not mean to make an offer. Even had other things suited, there would have been something distasteful to him in doing this so quickly after the affair of Miss Wanless. He was in no frame now for making love, but yet it would be ungracious in him, he thought, to leave Beetham without seeing his old friend. He found the two ladies together, with the children still around them, sitting near a window which opened down to the ground. Mrs. Dugdale had a novel in hand, and, as usual, was leaning back in a rocking chair. Alice had also a book open on the table before her, but she was bending over a sewing machine. They had latterly divided the cares of the family between them. Mrs. Dugdale had brought the children into the world, and Alice had washed, clothed, and fed them when they were there. When the Major entered the room, Alice's mind was of course full of the tidings she had heard from her father, which tidings, however, had not been communicated to Mrs. Dugdale. Alice at first was very silent while Mrs. Dugdale asked as to the festivities. "It has been the grandest thing anywhere about here for a long time." "And, like other grand things, a great bore," said the Major. "I don't suppose you found it so, Major Rossiter," said the lady. Then the conversation ran away into a description of what had been done during the day. He wished to make it understood that there was no permanent link binding him to Brook Park, but he hardly knew how to say it without going beyond the lines of ordinary conversation. At last there seemed to be an opening, not exactly what he wished, but still an opening. "Brook Park is not exactly the place," said he, "at which I should ever feel myself quite at home." This was in answer to some chance word which had fallen from Mrs. Dugdale. "I am sorry for that," said Alice. She would have given a guinea to bring the word back after it had been spoken, but spoken words cannot be brought back. "Why sorry?" he asked, smiling. "Because it is so likely that you may be there often." "I don't know that at all." "You have become so intimate with them," said Alice. "We are told in Beetham that the party was got up all for your honour." So Sir Walter had told him, and so Maria, the naughty girl, had said also. "Only for your beaux yeux, Major Rossiter, we shouldn't have had any party at all." This had been said by Maria when she was laughing at him about her sister Georgiana. "I don't know how that may be," said the Major, "but all the same I shall never be at home at Brook Park." "Don't you like the young ladies?" asked Mrs. Dugdale. "Oh yes, very much, and Lady Wanless, and Sir Walter. I like them all in a way. But yet I shall never find myself at home at Brook Park." Alice was very angry with him. He ought not to have gone there at all. He must have known that he could not be there without paining her. She thoroughly believed that he was engaged to marry the girl of whose family he spoke in this way. He had thought, so it seemed to her, that he might lessen the blow to her by making little of the great folk among whom his future lot was to be cast. But what could be more mean? He was not the John Rossiter to whom she had given her heart. There had been no such man. She had been mistaken. "I am afraid you are one of those," she said, "who, wherever they find themselves, at once begin to wish for something better." "That is meant to be severe." "My severity won't go for much." "I am sure you deserved it," said Mrs. Dugdale most indiscreetly. "Is this intended for an attack?" he asked, looking from one to the other. "Not at all," said Alice, affecting to laugh. "I should have said nothing if I thought mamma would take it up so seriously. I was only sorry to hear you speak of your new friends so slightingly." After that the conversation between them was very difficult, and he soon got up to go away. As he did so he asked Alice to say a word to him out in the garden, having already explained to them both that it might be some time before he would be again down at Beetham. Alice rose slowly from her sewing machine, and putting on her hat led the way with a composed and almost dignified step out through the window. Her heart was beating within her, but she looked as though she were mistress of every pulse. "Why did you say that to me?" he asked. "Say what?" "That I always wished for better things and better people than I found?" "Because I think you ambitious and discontented. There is nothing disgraceful in that, though it is not the character which I myself like the best." "You meant to allude specially to the Wanlesses?" "Because you have just come from there, and were speaking of them." "And to one of that family specially?" "No, Major Rossiter, there you are wrong. I allude to no one in particular." "They are nothing to me. I do not know them, but I hear that they are kind and friendly people with good manners and very handsome. Of course I know, as we all know everything of each other in this little place, that you have of late become very intimate with them. Then when I hear you aver that you are already discontented with them, I cannot help thinking that you are hard to please. I am sorry that mamma spoke of deserving. I did not intend to say anything so seriously." "Alice!" "Well, Major Rossiter?" "I wish I could make you understand me." "I do not know that that would do any good. We have been old friends, and of course I hope that you may be happy. I must say good-bye now. I cannot go beyond the gate, because I am wanted to take the children out." "Good-bye, then. I hope you will not think ill of me." "Why should I think ill of you? I think very well, only that you are ambitious." As she said this she laughed again, and then she left him. He had been most anxious to tell her that he was not going to marry that girl, but he had not known how to do it. He could not bring himself to declare that he would not marry a girl, when by such declaration he would have been forced to assume that he might marry her if he pleased. So he left Alice at the gate, and she went back to the house, still convinced that he was betrothed to Georgiana Wanless. Chapter 8. Section 38 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 8. Sir Walter up in London. The Major, when he left the doctor's house, was more thoroughly in love with Alice than ever. There had been something in her gait as she led the way out through the window, and again, as with determined purpose she bade him speedily farewell at the gate, which forced him to acknowledge that the dragging of perambulators and the making of petticoats had not detracted from her feminine charm or from her feminine dignity. She had been dressed in her ordinary morning frock, the very frock on which he had more than once seen the marks of Bobby's dirty heels. But she had pleased his eyes better than Georgiana, clad in all the glory of her toxopholite array. The toxopholite feather had been very knowing, the tight leathern belt round her waist had been bright in colour and pretty in design. The looped-up dress, fit for the work in hand, had been gratifying. But with it all there had been the show of a thing got up for ornament and not for use. She was like a box of painted sugar plums, very pretty to the eye, but of which no one wants to extract any for the purpose of eating them. Alice was like a housewife's store, kept beautifully in order, but intended chiefly for comfortable use. As he went up to London he began to doubt whether he would go abroad. Were he to let a few months pass by, would not Alice be still there, and willing perhaps to receive him with more kindness when she should have heard that his follies at Brook Park were at an end? 3 days after his return, when he was sitting in his offices, thinking perhaps more of Alice Dugdale than of the whole British cavalry, a soldier who was in waiting brought a card to him. Sir Walter Wanless had come to call upon him. If he were disengaged, Sir Walter would be glad to see him. He was not at all anxious to see Sir Walter, but there was no alternative, and Sir Walter was shown into the room. In explaining the purport of Sir Walter's visit, we must go back for a few minutes to Brook Park. When Sir Walter came down to breakfast on the morning after the festivities, he was surprised to hear that Major Rossiter had taken his departure. There sat young Burmeston. He, at any rate, was safe. And there sat young Cobble, who by Sophia's aid had managed to get himself accommodated for the night, and all the other young people, including the 5 Wanless girls. The father, though not observant, could see that Georgiana was very glum. Lady Wanless herself affected a good humour which hardly deceived him, and certainly did not deceive any one else. "He was obliged to be off this morning because of his duties," said Lady Wanless. "He told me that it was going to be so, but I did not like to say anything about it yesterday." Georgiana turned up her nose, as much as to say that the going and coming of Major Rossiter was not a matter of much importance to any one there, and least of all to her. Except the father, there was not a person in the room who was not aware that Lady Wanless had missed her fish. But she herself was not quite sure even yet that she had failed altogether. She was a woman who hated failure, and who seldom failed. She was brave of heart, too, and able to fight a losing battle to the last. She was very angry with the Major, whom she well knew was endeavouring to escape from her toils. But he would not on that account be the less useful as a son-in-law, nor on that account was she the more willing to allow him to escape. With 5 daughters without fortunes, it behoved her as a mother to be persistent. She would not give it up, but must turn the matter well in her mind before she took further steps. She feared that a simple invitation could hardly bring the Major back to Brook Park. Then there came the letter from the Major, which did not make the matter easier. "My dear," she said to her husband, sitting down opposite to him in the room, "that Major Rossiter isn't behaving quite as he ought to do." "I'm not a bit surprised," said the Baronet angrily. "I never knew anybody from Wadham who behaved well." "He's quite a gentleman, if you mean that," said Lady Wanless, "and he's sure to do very well in the world, and poor Georgiana is really fond of him, which doesn't surprise me in the least." "Has he said anything to make her fond of him? I suppose she has gone and made a fool of herself, like Maria." "Not at all. He has said a great deal to her, much more than he ought to have done if he meant nothing. But the truth is, young men nowadays never know their own minds unless there is somebody to keep them up to the mark. You must go and see him." "I?" said the afflicted father. "Of course, my dear. A few judicious words in such a case may do so much. I would not ask Walter to go," Walter was the eldest son, who was with his regiment, "because it might lead to quarrelling. I would not have anything of that kind, if only for the dear girl's sake." "But what you would say would be known to nobody, and it might have the desired effect. Of course you will be very quiet, and very serious also. Nobody could do it better than you will. There can be no doubt that he has trifled with the dear girl's affections. Why else has he been with her whenever he has been here? It was so visible on Wednesday that everybody was congratulating me. Old Lady Deepbell asked whether the day was fixed. I treated him quite as though it were settled. Young men do so often get these sudden starts of doubt. Then sometimes just a word afterwards will put it all right." In this way the Baronet was made to understand that he must go and see the Major. He postponed the unwelcome task till his wife at last drove him out of the house. "My dear," she said, "will you let your child die broken-hearted for want of a word?" When it was put to him in that way, he found himself obliged to go, though, to tell the truth, he could not find any sign of heartbreaking sorrow about his child. He was not allowed to speak to Georgiana herself, his wife telling him that the poor child would be unable to bear it. Sir Walter, when he was shown into the Major's room, felt himself to be very ill able to conduct the business in hand, and to the Major himself the moment was one of considerable trouble. He had thought it possible that he might receive an answer to his letter, a reply that might be indignant or piteous, admonitory or simply abusive as the case might be, one which might too probably require a further correspondence, but it had never occurred to him that Sir Walter would come in person. But here he was, in the room, by no means with that pretended air of geniality with which he had last received the Major down at Brook Park. The greeting, however, between the gentlemen was courteous, if not cordial, and then Sir Walter began his task. "We were quite surprised you should have left us so early in the morning." "I had told Lady Wanless." "Yes, I know. Nevertheless, we were surprised. Now, Major Rossiter, what do you mean to do about this young lady?" The Major sat silent. He could not pretend to be ignorant what young lady was intended after the letter which he himself had written to Lady Wanless. "This, you know, is a very painful kind of thing, Major Rossiter." "Very painful indeed, Sir Walter." "When I remembered that I had been at Christchurch and your excellent father at Wadham both at the same time, I thought that I might trust you in my house without the slightest fear." "I make bold to say, Sir Walter, that you were quite justified in that expectation, whether it was founded on your having been at Christchurch or on my position and character in the world." He knew that the scene would be easier to him if he could work himself up to a little indignation on his own part. "And yet I am told. What are you told, Sir Walter?" "There can, I think, be no doubt that you have, in point of fact, paid attention to my daughter." Sir Walter was a gentleman, and felt that the task imposed upon him grated against his better feelings. "If you mean that I have taken steps to win her affections, you have been wrongly informed." "That's what I do mean. Were you not received just now at Brook Park as paying attention to her?" "I hope not." "You hope not, Major Rossiter?" "I hope no such mistake was made. It certainly was not made by me. I felt myself much flattered by being received at your house. I wrote the other day a line or two to Lady Wanless, and thought I had explained all this." Sir Walter opened his eyes when he heard, for the first time, of the letter, but was sharp enough not to exhibit his ignorance at the moment. "I don't know about explaining," he said. "There are some things which can't be so very well explained. My wife assures me that the poor girl has been deceived, cruelly deceived. Now, I put it to you, Major Rossiter, what ought you as a gentleman to do?" "Really, Sir Walter, you are not entitled to ask me any such question." "Not on behalf of my own child?" "I cannot go into the matter from that view of the case. I can only declare that I have said nothing and done nothing for which I can blame myself. I cannot understand how there should have been such a mistake, but it did not at any rate arise with me." Then the baronet sat dumb. He had been specially instructed not to give up the interview till he had obtained some sign of weakness from the enemy. If he could only induce the enemy to promise another visit to Brook Park, that would be much. If he could obtain some expression of liking or admiration for the young lady, that would be something. If he could induce the Major to allude to delay as being necessary, farther operations would be founded on that base. But nothing had been obtained. "It's the most astonishing thing I ever heard," he said at last. "I do not know that I can say anything further." "I'll tell you what," said the baronet. "Come down and see Lady Wanless. The women understand these things much better than we do. Come down and talk it over with Lady Wanless. She won't propose anything that isn't proper." In answer to this the Major shook his head. "You won't?" "It would do no good, Sir Walter. It would be painful to me, and must, I should say, be distressing to the young lady." "Then you won't do anything?" "There is nothing to be done." "Upon my word, I never heard such a thing in all my life, Major Rossiter. You come down to my house, and then you won't come again. To be sure, he was at Wadham, but I did think your father's son would have behaved better." Then he picked up his hat from the floor and shuffled out of the room without another word. Tidings that Sir Walter had been up to London and had called upon Major Rossiter made their way into Beetham and reached the ears of the Dugdales, but not correct tidings as to the nature of the conversation. "I wonder when it will be," said Mrs. Dugdale to Alice. "As he has been up to town, I suppose it'll be settled soon." "The sooner the better for all parties," said Alice cheerily. "When a man and a woman have agreed together, I can't see why they shouldn't at once walk off to the church arm in arm." "The lawyers have so much to do." "Bother the lawyers. The parson ought to do all that is necessary, and the sooner the better. Then there would not be such paraphernalia of presents and gowns and eatings and drinkings, all of which is got up for the good of the tradesmen. If I were to be married, I should like to slip out round the corner, just as though I were going to get an extra loaf of bread from Mrs. Bakewell." "That wouldn't do for my lady at Brook Park." "I suppose not." "Nor yet for the Major." Then Alice shook her head and sighed, and took herself out to walk alone for a few minutes among the lanes. How could it be that he should be so different from that which she had taken him to be? It was now September, and she could remember an early evening in May, when the leaves were beginning to be full, and they were walking together with the spring air fresh around them, just where she was now creeping alone with the more perfect and less fresh beauty of the autumn around her. How different a person he seemed to her to be now from that which he had seemed to be then, not different because he did not love her, but different because he was not fit to be loved. "Alice," he had said then, "you and I are alike in this, that simple, serviceable things are dear to both of us." The words had meant so much to her that she had never forgotten them. Was she simple and serviceable so that she might be dear to him? She had been sure then that he was simple and that he was serviceable so that she could love him. It was thus that she had spoken of him to herself, thinking herself to be sure of his character. And now, before the summer was over, he was engaged to marry such a one as Georgiana Wanless, and to become the hero of a fashionable wedding. But she took pride to herself as she walked alone that she had already overcome the bitterness of the malady, which for a day or two had been so heavy that she had feared for herself that it would oppress her. For a day or two after that farewell at the gate, she had with a rigid purpose tied herself to every duty, even to the duty of looking pleasant in her father's eyes, of joining in the children's games, of sharing the gossip of her stepmother. But this she had done with an agony that nearly crushed her. Now she had won her way through it, and could see her path before her. She had not cured altogether that wound in her heart, but she had assured herself that she could live on without further interference from the wound. End of chapter 8. Section 39 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 9. Lady Deepbell. Then by degrees it began to be rumoured about the country, and at last through the lanes of Beetham itself, that the alliance between Major Rossiter and Miss Georgiana Wanless was not quite a settled thing. Mr. Burmeston had whispered in Slowbridge that there was a screw loose, perhaps thinking that if another could escape, why not he also? Cobble, who had no idea of escaping, declared his conviction that Major Rossiter ought to be horsewhipped. But Lady Deepbell was the real town crier, who carried the news far and wide. But all of them heard it before Alice, and when others believed it, Alice did not believe it, or indeed care to believe or not to believe. Lady Deepbell filled a middle situation, halfway between the established superiority of Brook Park and the recognised humility of Beetham. Her title went for something, but her husband had been only a civil service knight, who had deserved well of his country by a meritorious longevity. She lived in a pretty little cottage half-way between Brook Park and Beetham, which was just large enough to enable her to talk of her grounds. She loved Brook Park dearly, and all the county people, but in her love for social intercourse generally she was unable to eschew the more frequent gatherings of the village. She was intimate not only with Mrs. Rossiter, but with the Tweeds and Dugdales and Simpkinses, and while she could enjoy greatly the grandeur of the Wanless aristocracy, so could she accommodate herself comfortably to the cosy gossip of the Beethamites. It was she who first spread the report in Beetham that Major Rossiter was, as she called it, off. She first mentioned the matter to Mrs. Rossiter herself, but this she did in a manner more subdued than usual. The alliance had been high, and she was inclined to think that Mrs. Rossiter would be disappointed. "We did think, Mrs. Rossiter, that these young people at Brook Park had meant something the other day." Mrs. Rossiter did not stand in awe of Lady Deepbell, and was not pleased at the allusion. "It would be much better if young people could be allowed to arrange their own affairs without so much tattling about it," she said angrily. "That's all very well, but tongues will talk, you know, Mrs. Rossiter. I am sorry for both their sakes, because I thought that it would do very well." "Very well indeed, if the young people, as you call them, liked each other." "But I suppose it's over now, Mrs. Rossiter." "I really know nothing about it, Lady Deepbell." Then the old woman, quite satisfied after this that the alliance had fallen to the ground, went on to the Tweeds. "I never thought it would come to much," said Mrs. Tweed. "I don't see why it shouldn't," said Matilda Tweed. "Georgiana Wanless is good looking in a certain way, but they none of them have a penny, and Major Rossiter is quite a fashionable man." The Tweeds were quite outside the Wanless pale, and it was the feeling of this that made Matilda love to talk about the second Miss Wanless by her Christian name. "I suppose he will go back to Alice now," said Clara, the younger Tweed girl. "I don't see that at all," said Mrs. Tweed. "I never believed much in that story," said Lady Deepbell. "Nor I either," said Matilda. "He used to walk about with her, but what does that come to? The children were always with them. I never would believe that he was going to make so little of himself." "But is it quite sure that all the affair at Brook Park will come to nothing after the party and everything?" asked Mrs. Tweed. "Quite positive," said Lady Deepbell authoritatively. "I am able to say certainly that it is all over." Then she toddled off and went to the Simpkinses. The rumour did not reach the doctor's house on that day. The conviction that Major Rossiter had behaved badly to Alice, that Alice had been utterly thrown over by the Wanless alliance, had been so strong that even Lady Deepbell had not dared to go and probe wilfully that wound. The feeling in this respect had been so general that no one in Beetham had been hard-hearted enough to speak to Alice either of the triumph of Miss Wanless or of the misconduct of the Major, and now Lady Deepbell was afraid to carry her story thither. It was the doctor himself who first brought the tidings to the house, and did not do this till some days after Lady Deepbell had been in the village. "You had better not say anything to Alice about it." Such at first had been the doctor's injunction to his wife. "One way or the other it will only be a trouble to her." Mrs. Dugdale, full of her secret, anxious to be obedient, thinking that the gentleman relieved from his second love would be ready at once to be on again with his first, was so fluttered and fussy that Alice knew that there was something to be told. "You have got some great secret, mamma," she said. "What secret, Alice?" "I know you have. Don't wait for me to ask you to tell it. If it is to come, let it come." "I'm not going to say anything." "Very well, mamma. Then nothing shall be said." "Alice, you are the most provoking young woman I ever had to deal with in my life. If I had 20 secrets, I would not tell you one of them." On the next morning Alice heard it all from her father. "I knew there was something by mamma's manner," she said. "I told her not to say anything." "So I suppose. But what does it matter to me, papa, whether Major Rossiter does or does not marry Miss Wanless? If he has given her his word, I am sure I hope that he will keep it." "I don't suppose he ever did." "Even then it doesn't matter. Papa, do not trouble yourself about him." "But you?" "I have gone through the fire, and have come out without being much scorched. Dear papa, I do so wish that you should understand it all. It is so nice to have some one to whom everything can be told. I did like him." "And he?" "I have nothing to say about that, not a word. Girls, I suppose, are often foolish, and take things for more than they are intended to mean. I have no accusation to make against him. But I did allow myself to be weak. Then came this about Miss Wanless, and I was unhappy. I woke from a dream, and the waking was painful. But I have got over it. I do not think that you will ever know from your girl's manner that anything has been the matter with her." "My brave girl!" "But don't let mamma talk to me as though he could come back because the other girl has not suited him. He is welcome to the other girl, welcome to do without her, welcome to do with himself as it may best please him, but he shall not trouble me again." There was a stern strength in her voice as she said this which forced her father to look at her almost with amazement. "Do not think that I am fierce, papa." "Fierce, my darling." "But that I am in earnest. Of course, if he comes to Beetham, we shall see him. But let him be like anybody else. Don't let it be supposed that because he flitted here once and was made welcome, like a bird that comes in at the window, and then flitted away again, that he can be received at the window just as before, should he fly this way any more. That's all, papa." Then, as before, she went off by herself, to give herself renewed strength by her solitary thinkings. She had so healed the flesh round the wound that there was no longer danger of mortification. She must now take care that there should be no further wound. The people around her would be sure to tell her of this breach between her late lover and the Wanless young lady. The Tweeds and the Simpkinses and old Lady Deepbell would be full of it. She must take care so to answer them at the first word that they should not dare talk to her of Major Rossiter. She had cured herself so that she no longer staggered under the effects of the blow. Having done that, she would not allow herself to be subject to the little stings of the little creatures around her. She had had enough of love, of a man's love, and would make herself happy now with Bobby and the other bairns. "He'll be sure to come back," said Mrs. Dugdale to her husband. "We shall do no good by talking about it," said the doctor. "If you will take my advice, you will not mention his name to her. I fear that he is worthless and unworthy of mention." That might be very well, thought Mrs. Dugdale, but no one in the village doubted that he had at the very least £1,500 a year, and that he was a handsome man, and such a one as is not to be picked up under every hedge. The very men who go about the world most like butterflies before marriage steady down the best afterwards. These were her words as she discussed the matter with Mrs. Tweed, and they both agreed that if the hero showed himself at the doctor's house, bygones ought to be bygones. Lady Wanless, even after her husband's return from London, declared to herself that even yet the game had not been altogether played out. Sir Walter, who had been her only possible direct messenger to the man himself, had been, she was aware, as bad a messenger as could have been selected. He could be neither authoritative nor persuasive. Therefore, when he told her on coming home that it was easy to perceive that Major Rossiter's father could not have been educated at Christchurch, she did not feel very much disappointed. As her next step, she determined to call on Mrs. Rossiter. If that should fail, she must beard the lion in his den, and go herself to Major Rossiter at the Horse Guards. She did not doubt but that she would at least be able to say more than Sir Walter. Mrs. Rossiter, she was aware, was herself favourable to the match. "My dear Mrs. Rossiter," she said in her most confidential manner, "there is a little something wrong among these young people which I think you and I can put right if we put our heads together." "If I know one of the young people," said Mrs. Rossiter, "it will be very hard to make him change his mind." "He has been very attentive to the young lady." "Of course I know nothing about it, Lady Wanless. I never saw them together." "Dear Georgiana is so very quiet that she said nothing even to me, but I really thought that he had proposed to her. She won't say a word against him, but I believe he did. Now, Mrs. Rossiter, what has been the meaning of it?" "How is a mother to answer for her son, Lady Wanless?" "No, of course not. I know that. Girls, of course, are different. But I thought that perhaps you might know something about it, for I did imagine you would like the connection." "So I should. Why not? Nobody thinks more of birth than I do, and nothing in my opinion could have been nicer for John. But he does not see with my eyes. If I were to talk to him for a week it would have no effect." "Is it that girl of the doctor's, Mrs. Rossiter?" "I think not. My idea is, when he has turned it all over in his mind, he has come to the conclusion that he will be better without a wife than with one." "We might cure him of that, Mrs. Rossiter. If I could only have him down there at Brook Park for another week, I am sure he would come too." Mrs. Rossiter, however, could not say that she thought it probable that her son would be induced soon to pay another visit to Brook Park. A week after this, Lady Wanless absolutely did find her way into the Major's presence at the Horse Guards, but without much success. The last words at that interview only shall be given to the reader, the last words as they were spoken both by the lady and by the gentleman. "Then I am to see my girl die of a broken heart?" said Lady Wanless, with her handkerchief up to her eyes. "I hope not, Lady Wanless, but in whatever way she might die, the fault would not be mine." There was a frown on the gentleman's brow as he said this, which cowed even the lady. As she went back to Slowbridge that afternoon, and then home to Brook Park, she determined at last that the game must be looked upon as played out. There was no longer any ground on which to stand and fight. Before she went to bed that night she sent for Georgiana. "My darling child," she said, "that man is unworthy of you." "I always thought he was," said Georgiana. And so there was an end to that little episode in the family of the Wanlesses. End of chapter 9. Section 40 of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice Dugdale by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 10. The Bird that Pecked at the Window. The bird that had flown in at the window and had been made welcome had flown away ungratefully. Let him come again pecking as he might at the window, no more crumbs of love should be thrown to him. Alice, with a steady purpose, had resolved on that. With all her humble ways, her continual darning of stockings, her cutting of bread and butter for the children, her pushing of the perambulator in the lanes, there was a pride about her, a knowledge of her own dignity as a woman, which could have been stronger in the bosom of no woman of title, of wealth, or of fashion. She claimed nothing. She had expected no admiration. She had been contented to take the world as it came to her, without thinking much of love or romance. When John Rossiter had first shown himself at Beetham, after his return from India, and when he had welcomed her so warmly, too warmly, as his old playfellow, no idea had occurred to her that he would ever be more to her than her old playfellow. Her own heart was too precious to herself to be given away idly to the first comer. Then the bird had flown in at the window, and it had been that the coming of the stranger had been very sweet to her. But, even for the stranger, she would not change her ways, unless perchance some day she might appertain to the stranger. Then it would be her duty to fit herself entirely to him. In the meantime, when he gave her little hints that something of her domestic slavery might be discontinued, she would not abate a jot from her duties. If he liked to come with her when she pushed the children, let him come. If he cared to see her when she was darning a stocking or cutting bread and butter, let him pay his visits. If he thought those things derogatory, certainly let him stay away. So the thing had grown till she found herself surprised, and taken, as it were, into a net, caught in a pitfall of love. But she held her peace, stuck manfully to the perambulator, and was a little colder in her demeanour than heretofore. Whereupon Major Rossiter, as the reader is aware, made 2 visits to Brook Park. The bird might peck at the window, but he should never again be taken into the room. But the bird, from the moment in which he had packed up his portmanteau at Brook Park, had determined that he would be taken in at the window again, that he would at any rate return to the window and peck at the glass with constancy, soliciting that it might be opened. As he now thought of the 2 girls, the womanliness of the one, as compared with the worldliness of the other, conquered him completely. There had never been a moment in which his heart had in truth inclined itself towards the young athlete of Brook Park, never a moment, hardly a moment, in which his heart had been untrue to Alice. But glitter had for a while prevailed with him, and he had, just for a moment, allowed himself to be discontented with the homely colour of unalloyed gold. He was thoroughly ashamed of himself, knowing well that he had given pain. He had learned, clearly enough from what her father, mother, and others had said to him, that there were those who expected him to marry Alice Dugdale, and others who hoped that he would marry Georgiana Wanless. Now at last he could declare that no other love than that which was warm within his heart at present could ever have been possible to him. But he was aware that he had much to do to recover his footing. Alice's face and her manner as she bade him good-bye at the gate were very clear before his eyes. 2 months passed by before he was again seen at Beetham. It had happened that he was, in truth, required elsewhere, on duty, during the period, and he took care to let it be known at Beetham that such was the case. Information to this effect was, in some shape, sent to Alice. Openly she took no notice of it, but inwardly she said to herself that they who troubled themselves by sending her such tidings troubled themselves in vain. Men may come and men may go, she sang to herself in a low voice. How little they knew her to come to her with news as to Major Rossiter's coming and going. Then one day he came. One morning early in December the absolute fact was told at the dinner table. "The Major is at the parsonage," said the maidservant. Mrs. Dugdale looked at Alice, who continued, however, to distribute hashed mutton with an equanimity which betrayed no flaw. After that not a word was said about him. The doctor had warned his wife to be silent, and though she would fain have spoken, she restrained herself. After dinner the usual work went on, and then the usual playing in the garden. The weather was dry and mild for the time of year, so that Alice was swinging 2 of the children when Major Rossiter came up through the gate. Minnie, who had been a favourite, ran to him, and he came slowly across the lawn to the tree on which the swing was hung. For a moment Alice stopped her work that she might shake hands with him, and then at once went back to her place. "If I were to stop a moment before Bobby has had his turn," she said, "he would feel the injustice." "No, I isn't," said Bobby. "Oo may go as time." "But I don't want to go, Bobby, and Major Rossiter will find mamma in the drawing-room." And Alice for a moment thought of getting her hat and going off from the place. Then she reflected that to run away would be cowardly. She did not mean to run away always because the man came. Had she not settled it with herself that the man should be nothing to her? Then she went on swinging the children, very deliberately, in order that she might be sure of herself that the man's coming had not even flurried her. In 10 minutes the Major was there again. It had been natural to suppose that he should not be detained long in conversation by Mrs. Dugdale. "May I swing one of them for a time?" he asked. "Well, no, I think not. It is my allotted exercise, and I never give it up." But Minnie, who knew what a strong arm could do, was imperious, and the Major got possession of the swing. Then of a sudden he stopped. "Alice," he said, "I want you to take a turn with me up the road." "I am not going out at all to day," she said. Her voice was steady and well preserved, but there was a slight rising of colour on her cheeks. "But I wish it expressly. You must come to day." She could consider only for a moment, but for a moment she did think the matter over. If the man chose to speak to her seriously, she must listen to him, once and once only. So much he had a right to demand. When a bird of that kind pecks in that manner, some attention must be paid to him. So she got her hat, and leading the way down the road, opened the gate and turned up the lane away from the street of the village. For some yards he did not speak. She, indeed, was the first to do so. "I cannot stay out very long, Major Rossiter. So, if there is anything—" "There is something, Alice." Of course she knew, but she was quite resolved. Resolved! Had not every moment of her life since last she had parted with him been given up to the strengthening of this resolution? Not a stitch had gone through the calico which had not been pulled the tighter by the tightening of her purpose. And now he was there. Oh, how more than earthly sweet it had been to have him there when her resolutions had been of another kind! But she had been punished for that, and was strong against such future ills. "Alice, it had better come out simply. I love you, and have ever loved you with all my heart." Then there was a frown, and a little trampling of the ground beneath her feet, but she said not a word. "Oh, if it only could have come sooner, a few weeks sooner!" "I know what you would say to me, but I would have you listen to me, if possible, before you say it. I have given you cause to be angry with me." "Oh, no!" she cried, interrupting him. "But I have never been untrue to you for a moment. You seem to slight me." "And if I did?" "That may pass. If you should slight me now, I must bear it. Even though you should deliberately tell me that you cannot love me, I must bear that. But with such a load of love as I have at my heart, it must be told to you. Day and night it covers me from head to foot. I can think of nothing else. I dream that I have your hand in mine, but when I wake I think it can never be so." There was an instinct with her at the moment to let her fingers glide into his, but it was shown only by the gathering together of her two hands, so that no rebellious figures straying from her in that direction might betray her. "If you have never loved me, never can love me, say so, and I will go away." She should have spoken now upon the instant, but she simply moved her foot upon the gravel and was silent. That I should be punished might be right. If it could be possible that the punishment should extend to two, that could not be right. She did not want to punish him, only to be brave herself. If to be obdurate would in truth make him unhappy, then would it be right that she should still be firm? It would be bad enough after so many self-assurances to succumb at the first word. But for his sake, would it not be possible to bear even that? "If you never have loved me, and never can love me, say so, and I will go." Even to herself she had not pledged herself to lie. If he asked her to be his wife in the plain way, she could say that she would not. Then the way would be plain before her. But what reply was she to make in answer to such a question as this? Could she say that she had not loved him, or did not love him? "Alice," he said, putting his hand up to her arm. "No." "Alice, can you not forgive me?" "I have forgiven." "And will you not love me?" She turned her face upon him with a purpose to frown, but the fulness of his eyes upon her was too much, and the frown gave way, and a tear came into her eye, and her lips trembled. And then she acknowledged to herself that her resolution had not been worth a straw to her. It should be added that considerably before Alice's wedding, both Sophia and Georgiana Wanless were married, Sophia in due order, as of course, to young Cobble, and Georgiana to Mr. Burmeston the brewer. This, as the reader will remember, was altogether unexpected, but it was a great and guiding principle with Lady Wanless that the girls should not be taken out of their turns. End of Chapter 10. End of Alice Dugdale, by Anthony Trollope. End of Why Frau Frohmann Raised Her Prices, and Other Stories.